I've always preferred solitude. There's a simple comfort in being alone with my thoughts, away from the constant noise and demands of other people. It's why my annual solo camping trip had become more than just a tradition. It was a necessity, a way to recalibrate my mind after months of enduring the relentless chaos of city life. That Friday morning in June, I loaded my hiking pack into the trunk of my sedan, carefully checking my supplies one last time. Water purification tablets, first aid kit, multi-tool compass maps, 3 days' worth of dehydrated meals, sleeping bag rated for the Florida summer nights, and my trusty one-person tent. Everything had its place, meticulously organized as always. The drive from Jacksonville to Ocala National Forest took just under 2 hours. I'd chosen Ocala specifically because it lacked the tourist appeal of more popular parks. Its 383,000 acres of dense woods, natural springs, and scrubland offered the isolation I craved. Most visitors stuck to the designated campgrounds and popular trails, leaving vast stretches of wilderness virtually untouched. Perfect. I pulled into the visitor center parking lot around noon, the summer heat already pressing down like a physical weight. Inside, I found a middle-aged ranger with a weathered face and a name tag that read Morton. He barely looked up from his computer as I approached the counter. "Planning to camp?" he asked, his tone suggesting he'd repeated this question thousands of times. "Yes, solo hike-in, 3 nights. This caught his attention. His eyes lifted to assess me properly. "Which area you headed to?" "I was thinking about exploring the northeastern section," I said, pointing to a relatively unmarked area on the large wall map behind him, past Hopkins Prairie. Morton frowned slightly. "Not many established trails out that way. Easy to get turned around." I offered my most confident smile. "I've been coming here for 5 years now. I know what I'm doing." He didn't seem convinced, but slid the permit forms across the counter anyway. "Fill these out. Make sure you mark your intended route, even if it's approximate." After completing the paperwork and paying the nominal fee, I turned to leave. "One more thing," Morton called after me. "We've had some unusual wildlife reports from that area recently. Probably nothing, but stay alert, all right?" I nodded, not particularly concerned. Florida woods were full of black bears, wild boars, and the occasional panther. Nothing I hadn't prepared for. The drive to my intended starting point took another 40 minutes. The paved road eventually giving way to packed dirt, then little more than a trail barely wide enough for my car. I parked in a small clearing, shouldered my pack, and locked the vehicle. The forest welcomed me with its familiar symphony, wind rustling through pine needles, distant bird calls, the occasional scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush. I breathed deeply, savoring the scent of sun-warmed earth and vegetation. This was what I had come for. I hiked for about 3 hours, following game trails and occasionally consulting my compass and map. The terrain gradually changed as I moved deeper into the forest. The pines became taller, their trunks wider, the spacing between them more irregular. Patches of saw palmetto and dense shrubs forced me to detour frequently. By late afternoon, I found an ideal camping spot, a small clearing near a seasonal creek that still held water despite the summer heat. The location offered good drainage in case of rain, protection from wind, and enough open space to see approaching wildlife. Setting up camp was a ritual I enjoyed. I pitched my tent with practiced efficiency, collected firewood, filtered water from the creek, and prepared a simple dinner of rehydrated beef stew. As darkness fell, I built a small fire, more for comfort than necessity in the warm Florida night. The stars emerged one by one as the sky darkened to indigo, then black. Away from city lights, the Milky Way sprawled across the heavens in all its glory. I leaned back against my pack, nursing a cup of instant coffee, utterly content. This was my element. Alone, self-sufficient, answerable to no one. The stresses that had accumulated over months of dealing with demanding clients, traffic jams, and the constant noise of human proximity melted away. Out here, problems seemed smaller, more manageable. The fire burned down to embers as I finished my coffee. Tomorrow would be my first full day of exploration, and I wanted an early start. I extinguished the coals carefully, brushed my teeth using water from my canteen, and retreated to my tent. Sleep came easily, deep and dreamless, the kind only found after a day of physical exertion in fresh air. I woke once in the night, momentarily disoriented, thinking I'd heard something moving in the underbrush nearby. But after listening intently for several minutes and hearing nothing more, I drifted back to sleep. Morning arrived with the insistent calls of a pileated woodpecker hammering at a nearby dead tree. I stretched, feeling the pleasant soreness in my muscles from yesterday's hike. Breakfast was instant oatmeal and strong coffee, consumed while studying my map and planning the day's route. I decided to head northeast, toward an area marked only as undeveloped wilderness on my map. According to the topographical lines, there might be a natural spring or small pond there, which would make a good destination. I packed a day bag with essentials: water, energy bars, first aid kit, knife, fire starter, and rain poncho, leaving my tent and the rest of my gear secured at camp. As I shouldered the lighter pack and set off, I had no way of knowing that this simple decision would lead me into the heart of a nightmare. No way of knowing that the forest held secrets far darker than I could have imagined. No way of knowing that by nightfall, everything I understood about the natural world would be irreparably shattered. I was simply a man seeking solitude in the wilderness, about to find something else entirely. The morning hike began pleasantly enough. The air was still cool from the night, though the rising sun promised another scorching day ahead. I maintained a brisk pace, checking my compass occasionally to ensure I stayed on course toward the northeast. After about 2 hours, I noticed the forest changing subtly around me. The trees grew more densely packed, their canopies forming an almost continuous ceiling that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. The underbrush thinned out, replaced by a carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles that silenced my footsteps. It felt older here somehow, as if I'd crossed an invisible boundary into a part of the forest that time had forgotten. I paused to consult my map, taking a long drink from my water bottle. According to the topographical markings, I should be approaching higher ground, possibly a ridge that overlooked the depression where I suspected the spring might be. But the terrain didn't match the map. Instead of rising, the ground seemed to be sloping gradually downward. That's not right, I muttered to myself, turning the map to reorient it against my compass readings. I looked up, seeking the sun's position to confirm my direction, but the thick canopy obscured the sky almost completely. A flutter of unease passed through me. Getting lost in Ocala wasn't a death sentence. The forest wasn't that vast, and eventually I'd hit a road or trail if I walked in any direction long enough, but it would certainly ruin my carefully planned trip. I decided to continue for another hour. If the landscape still didn't match my map by then, I'd turn back and retrace my steps to camp. The forest grew quieter as I walked deeper. The usual ambient sounds, birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, faded until all I could hear was my own breathing and the occasional creak of a branch in the light breeze. The silence felt oppressive, unnatural. "Hello?" I called out, partly to break the eerie quiet, partly to reassure myself that sound still existed here. My voice seemed to travel only a few feet before being swallowed by the dense trees. No echo, no response, just immediate, smothering silence returning. Another hour passed, and the terrain still failed to match my map. The downward slope had leveled out, leading me into what appeared to be a natural depression surrounded by slightly higher ground on all sides. I should have turned back then, should have followed my own rule about retracing my steps, but something about this place drew me forward. Perhaps it was simple stubbornness, or maybe a genuine curiosity about what lay ahead. Either way, I pressed on. The trees began to thin slightly, allowing more sunlight to penetrate. I checked my watch. Nearly noon. If I wanted to make it back to camp before dark, I needed to start heading back soon. Just a little farther, I told myself, just to see what's beyond this section. The ground beneath my feet changed from packed earth and leaf litter to something softer, spongier. I looked down and noticed the soil had darkened, becoming almost black and damp. The vegetation changed too. Ferns appeared, then moss covering the tree trunks, signaling higher moisture levels. I must be approaching water, I thought. Perhaps the spring was here after all, just not where my map indicated. The trees opened up suddenly into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across. In the center lay a pool of water, perfectly circular, like a mirror embedded in the forest floor. The water was absolutely still, reflecting the tree canopy above with such perfect clarity that the boundary between reflection and reality seemed to blur. I approached cautiously. Natural springs weren't uncommon in Florida, but something about this one felt wrong. The water was clear but dark, suggesting considerable depth. No plants grew along its edge, just bare, black soil forming a perfect circle around the pool. Kneeling at the edge, I peered into the water. My reflection stared back with unsettling precision. I reached out, intending to test the temperature, but stopped just short of touching the surface. An instinctive warning flared in my mind, primitive and urgent. Don't touch it. I pulled my hand back, breathing harder than the mild exertion warranted. The silence around the pool seemed even more pronounced, as if the very air was holding its breath. I stood up and backed away, suddenly eager to leave this place. As I turned to go, movement caught my eye, just a flicker at the edge of my vision. I spun around, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing unusual, just trees, motionless in the still air. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Anyone there?" The silence absorbed my words like a sponge. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing. After a full minute, I convinced myself it had been a bird or squirrel, something mundane that my heightened senses had magnified. I checked my compass again and picked a direction that should lead me back toward my campsite. The sun had passed its zenith, and I wanted to return before dusk. Getting lost in Ocala at night wasn't an experience I cared to have. The journey back proved more difficult than I anticipated. The forest seemed to have rearranged itself while my attention was on the pool. Landmarks I thought I recognized turned out to be different on closer inspection. The downward slope I'd followed became confusingly irregular, with unexpected dips and rises. After an hour of walking, I should have been approaching familiar territory. Instead, the forest grew denser, darker, more tangled. I stopped to check my compass again, wondering if it had somehow been affected by local mineral deposits or some other natural phenomenon. The needle swung lazily, taking too long to settle, finally pointing in a direction that couldn't possibly be north based on the sun's position visible through an occasional break in the canopy. "What the hell?" I muttered, tapping the compass face. The needle wandered again, settling on a completely different heading. Real concern began to set in. I was no novice hiker, had never been truly lost before. I prided myself on my navigation skills. Yet here I was, unable to find my way back to a camp that shouldn't be more than a few miles away. I tried using the sun for navigation, but the increasingly thick canopy made that nearly impossible. My watch showed 3:17 p.m. I had maybe 4 hours of daylight left, enough time to find my way back if I kept my head clear and made good decisions. I picked the direction that seemed most likely based on my memory of the journey out, and started walking with purpose, marking trees with small notches from my knife as I went. At least now I'd know if I started going in circles. The forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead, visible in patches through the canopy. The temperature dropped noticeably. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising a summer storm. Just what I needed. The first fat drops of rain hit me about 20 minutes later, quickly turning into a downpour that penetrated even the dense tree cover. I pulled out my rain poncho and huddled beneath it, debating whether to continue or wait out the storm. Movement seemed preferable to standing still, so I pressed on, now thoroughly soaked below the knees despite the poncho. The rain brought an early twilight to the forest. I pulled out my flashlight, though it was still technically afternoon. Its beam seemed weak against the gathering darkness, illuminating only a small patch of ground ahead of me. The trees loomed like sentinels on all sides, their wet trunks gleaming black in the artificial light. I had been walking for nearly 2 hours since leaving the pool, and nothing looked familiar. Not a single landmark, not a single trail marker, just endless trees, their shapes distorted by rain and fading light. The rational part of my mind knew I couldn't have wandered that far from my campsite, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. I was lost, truly lost. As this realization settled over me, the rain intensified, drumming against my poncho with almost physical force. I needed shelter, needed to think clearly and make a plan. Continuing to wander blindly would only drive me deeper into unknown territory. A lightning flash illuminated the forest in stark relief, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now. Being under trees during lightning wasn't ideal, but in a forest this dense, I had little choice. I searched for a suitable spot to wait out the worst of the storm, ideally a depression in the ground or the shelter of a fallen tree. The beam of my flashlight caught something unexpected, a path, narrow but distinct, cutting through the underbrush ahead. Not a natural game trail, but something deliberately cleared with signs of regular use. Relief washed over me. A path meant people. People meant direction, civilization, safety. I followed the path eagerly, moving faster despite the treacherous footing. The rain began to ease slightly, though the darkness continued to deepen as evening approached. The path wound between trees, sometimes disappearing momentarily, only to reappear a few yards ahead. After following it for perhaps half a mile, I noticed something odd. The path wasn't leading toward any road or campground I knew of. In fact, it seemed to be taking me deeper into the forest, away from the direction where I believed the forest boundary should be. I slowed my pace, suddenly wary. Who would make a path that led nowhere? Or rather, who would make a path that led somewhere they didn't want easily found? My flashlight beam caught something ahead, a splash of color against the monotonous browns and greens of the forest. As I drew closer, the shape resolved itself, a deer carcass lying on its side directly across the path. Even from several yards away, I could tell something was wrong with it. The position was unnatural, the limbs bent at impossible angles. And there was something else, something my mind initially refused to process. The smell hit me then, a stench so powerful I staggered back, covering my nose with my sleeve. It wasn't just the normal smell of decomposition. This was older, deeper, more fundamentally wrong, like the earth itself had turned rancid. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam fixed on the dead animal. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, no longer loud enough to drown out the sound of my own ragged breathing. What I saw when I got closer made that breathing stop altogether. The deer, what remained of it, had been mangled beyond recognition. No natural predator could have done this. The body was torn open from neck to pelvis, the ribcage splayed outward like macabre wings. Internal organs were missing entirely, the cavity scraped clean. But it was the head that stopped my heart momentarily. The skull had been crushed, then seemingly reconstructed in a grotesque approximation of its original shape. Bits of fur and flesh still clung to the bone, but the eyes were gone, replaced with what looked like small stones pressed into the sockets. I'd seen animal kills before. The clean work of panthers, the messy feasting of bears and coyotes. This was something else entirely. This was deliberate, ritualistic. My hand shook as I directed the flashlight beam along the body, cataloging the horrors. The legs were broken in multiple places, then reset at bizarre angles. The spine had been partially extracted, then woven back through the flesh like thread through fabric. Patches of skin had been removed with surgical precision, while others were shredded to ribbons. "Jesus," I whispered, then immediately regretted making any sound at all. The forest had gone completely silent. No rain dripping from leaves, no distant thunder, no nocturnal insects beginning their nightly chorus. Nothing but absolute suffocating silence. I took a step back, then another, unable to tear my eyes from the mutilated deer. My heel caught on a root and I stumbled, nearly falling. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, hitting the ground with a dull thud and rolling a few feet away. Its beam carved a wild arc through the darkness before settling on the trees beyond the path. And there, illuminated in the harsh white light, was a handprint on a tree trunk. Not an animal print, not a smudge of dirt or natural discoloration. A human handprint, pressed into the bark with such force that it had left a perfect impression. Except it wasn't entirely human. The fingers were too long, the thumb positioned at an impossible angle. I lunged for my flashlight, grabbed it with trembling fingers, and swung the beam back to where I'd seen the print. It was gone. The bark was smooth, unmarked. I whirled around, sweeping the light in a frantic circle. The deer carcass remained, but everything else looked normal. Just trees and underbrush, wet from the recent rain. My heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I needed to get out of there, needed to find my way back to somewhere, anywhere that wasn't this place. I turned to retrace my steps along the path, only to discover it had vanished. Where moments before there had been a clear trail, now there was only unbroken forest floor, covered in fallen leaves and scattered twigs with no sign of recent passage. Panic clawed at my throat. I picked a direction, any direction, and started walking quickly, no longer concerned about marking my trail or maintaining a straight line. My only thought was to put distance between myself and that mutilated deer. I walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes according to my watch. The forest grew darker as night settled in fully. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate less distance with each passing minute, as if the darkness itself was becoming more solid, more resistant to light. Then I smelled it again, that ancient, wrong smell. Stronger this time, coming from somewhere ahead of me. Every instinct screamed to turn around, to run in the opposite direction, but a perverse curiosity pulled me forward. I needed to know what had done that to the deer. I slowed my pace, moving as quietly as possible, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The smell grew stronger, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. Through gaps in the trees ahead, I caught glimpses of open space, another clearing. Approaching the edge of the tree line, I crouched down, making myself as small and inconspicuous as possible. I switched off my flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The clearing was dimly visible in the faint starlight that penetrated the clouds. At first I saw nothing unusual, just an open space, maybe 50 feet across, ringed by trees. Then movement caught my eye. Something was in the center of the clearing, something large that blended so perfectly with the shadows that I had overlooked it initially. I squinted, trying to make out details. The shape shifted, unfolded, rose up to a height that seemed impossible for any forest creature. It stood on what appeared to be 4 limbs, but the proportions were all wrong. Too long, too angular, with joints that bent in multiple directions. My breath caught in my throat as it turned slowly, surveying the clearing. I couldn't make out its head clearly, but I had the distinct impression it was sniffing the air, searching for something. Searching for me. I froze, not daring to move a muscle. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't spotted me yet. Maybe if I stayed perfectly still, it would move on, and I could slip away once it was gone. The creature dropped to a crouch, its limbs folding in ways that made no anatomical sense. It pawed at the ground, digging into the soil with what I now saw were massive curved claws that gleamed dully in the faint light. After several minutes of this behavior, it straightened again and made a sound, a low, rumbling noise that wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite speech, but something unnervingly between the two. The sound reverberated through the clearing, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Then it happened. The clouds parted momentarily, allowing a shaft of moonlight to illuminate the clearing. For just a few seconds, I saw the creature clearly. It was wrong in every possible way. The body resembled a wolf in its basic shape, but grotesquely elongated and twisted. The fur was patchy, revealing skin beneath that wasn't skin at all, but something closer to bark or scales, depending on where you looked. The limbs bent at multiple joints, each ending in those terrible claws I'd glimpsed before. But it was the face that seared itself into my memory, that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was almost human, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but horribly distorted, as if someone had tried to create a human face without ever having seen one. The eyes were too wide set, the nose little more than 2 vertical slits, and the mouth, God, the mouth stretched nearly ear to ear, filled with jagged teeth that jutted in all directions. I must have made some small sound, a gasp, a whimper, because the creature's head snapped in my direction with unnatural speed. Those eyes, reflective like an animal's, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory, locked onto my position. For one frozen moment we stared at each other across the clearing. Then it smiled, there's no other word for it. its grotesque mouth stretching even wider, revealing row upon row of those mismatched teeth. I ran. All thought of stealth abandoned, I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me came sounds of pursuit, not the crashing you'd expect from a large predator, but something more controlled, more deliberate, quick, heavy footfalls that seemed to gain ground with terrifying efficiency. The forest blurred around me as I ran blindly, no destination in mind beyond a way. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but fear drove me forward with strength I didn't know I possessed. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was there, maybe 30 feet behind me, moving with a fluid grace that defied its twisted anatomy. It wasn't running at full speed, I realized with horror. It was pacing me, following easily, almost playfully. It was toying with me. I redoubled my efforts, pushing my body beyond what should have been possible. The terrain sloped upward, making my progress even more difficult. Sweat poured down my face despite the cool night air, stinging my eyes and plastering my shirt to my back. The upward slope ended abruptly at the edge of another clearing, larger than the previous one, with a massive, lightning-scarred oak dominating its center. I burst into the open space, momentarily disoriented by the sudden absence of trees around me. The creature paused at the tree line, prowling back and forth like a predator considering its options. It seemed reluctant to enter the clearing, which gave me a moment to catch my breath and assess my situation. I was exhausted, lost, being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. My options were severely limited. I could try to climb the oak, but somehow I knew the creature would be more than capable of following. I could continue running, but eventually my strength would give out. Or I could stand and fight, however futile that might be. I reached for my knife, a 7-inch fixed-blade hunting knife that had always seemed substantial until this moment. Now it felt laughably inadequate against the monster prowling at the edge of the clearing. The creature made that sound again, that not quite growl, not quite speech, and took a tentative step into the clearing, then another. Its movement changed as it left the cover of the trees, becoming more hunched, more cautious. It was afraid of the open space, I realized. Or perhaps not the space itself, but something about it. The scarred oak, the moonlight. Whatever the reason, it gave me a momentary advantage. I backed toward the great oak, keeping my eyes fixed on the advancing creature. It matched my pace, moving forward as I moved back, maintaining the distance between us. When my shoulders pressed against the rough bark of the tree trunk, I stopped, knife held before me in a white-knuckled grip. The creature stopped too, regarding me with those intelligent, predatory eyes. It cocked its head to one side, then the other, as if trying to understand what I planned to do next. "Stay back," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through me. The creature's mouth stretched in that horrible approximation of a smile again. Then it spoke. Or at least it made sounds that I could somehow understand, though they weren't quite human speech. "Lost," it said. The word mangled almost beyond recognition, forced through vocal cords never meant for human language. "All lost here." I pressed harder against the tree, the bark digging into my back through my thin shirt. "What are you?" The creature's head tilted again, considering. "Old," it finally replied. "Older than your kind remembers." It took another step forward, and I raised my knife higher, though we both knew it would provide little protection. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "Why are you hunting me?" "Hungry," it said simply. "Always hungry. You walked our paths, marked yourself." "Marked?" I repeated, confused. "The water," it said. "You touched our water." I hadn't touched the water, had stopped just short, but I'd been close enough apparently, close enough to mark myself somehow, to make myself a target. The creature took another step forward, now close enough that I could smell its foul odor, that ancient wrongness that had permeated the air around the mutilated deer. "No more talking," it said, its terrible mouth opening wider than should have been physically possible. It lunged. The creature's speed was terrifying. One moment it stood several yards away, the next it was upon me, those impossible limbs propelling it forward faster than any natural animal could move. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as its claws raked the air where I had just been standing. Bark exploded from the oak tree as the creature's attack missed me and connected with the trunk instead, leaving deep gouges in the ancient wood. I scrambled away on all fours, my knife forgotten in the dirt, pure survival instinct taking over. The creature recovered instantly, pivoting with unnatural agility to face me again. It made a sound, not words this time, but a high-pitched keening that sent pain lancing through my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound penetrated regardless, seeming to vibrate directly through my bones. Through watering eyes, I saw it preparing to lunge again. I cast about desperately for anything I could use as a weapon, spotting a fallen branch nearby. I lunged for it, fingers closing around the rough wood just as the creature sprang. I swung the branch with all my strength, connecting solidly with the side of the creature's head. The impact jarred my arms to the shoulder like hitting concrete. The branch snapped in two, leaving me holding a useless stump. The blow barely seemed to affect the creature. It shook its misshapen head once, then fixed those terrible eyes on me again. There was something new in its gaze now. Not just hunger, but rage. "You shouldn't have done that," it said, the mangled words somehow conveying cold fury. I backpedaled, searching for another weapon, another strategy, anything that might buy me a few more seconds of life. My back hit something solid, another tree at the edge of the clearing. I'd run out of space, out of options. The creature advanced slowly now, savoring my fear. Its mouth stretched in that terrible smile, saliva dripping from jagged teeth. "No more running," it said. "No more fighting." I pressed against the tree, a strange calm settling over me. If this was how I died, at least I would face it standing. "What are you?" I asked again, wanting to understand before the end. The creature paused, head tilting in that bird-like manner. "We were here first," it said, "before your kind, before names." It took another step closer, close enough now that I could feel its hot, fetid breath on my face. "Your kind forgot us, pushed us back, but we remember. We wait. A deafening crack split the night air. The creature jerked violently, a sound like tearing fabric escaping its throat. It staggered sideways, one twisted limb pawing at its flank, where dark liquid now seeped through the matted fur. Another crack echoed through the clearing, and the creature jerked again, falling to its knees. Its head whipped around, searching for the source of this new threat. A figure emerged from the tree line opposite us, rifle raised to shoulder level. Even in the dim light, I could see it was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confident grace of someone comfortable in the wilderness. "Get down," the man shouted, and I dropped instinctively as a third shot rang out. This bullet caught the creature in what passed for its chest. It released a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, part scream, part howl, so loud and piercing that I felt rather than heard my eardrums protest. The creature turned and lunged toward the rifleman with incredible speed despite its wounds. The man fired again, the shot going wide as he dived to the side to avoid the attack. I scrambled to my feet, spotting my knife glinting in the moonlight several yards away. I ran for it, scooped it up, and turned to see the creature and the rifleman locked in a desperate struggle. The man had his rifle crosswise between them, using it as a barrier to keep those terrible teeth and claws at bay. Without conscious thought, I charged, knife held before me like a spear. The creature was so focused on the rifleman that it didn't sense my approach until it was too late. I plunged the blade into its side with all my strength, feeling it sink deep into flesh that felt wrong, too dense, too fibrous to be muscle. The creature released an ear-splitting shriek and reared back, throwing the rifleman aside like a doll. It whirled to face me, one twisted limb reaching for the knife still embedded in its flank. Before it could reorient itself fully, another shot rang out. The rifleman had recovered his weapon and fired from where he lay on the ground. This bullet struck the creature's head, tearing away a chunk of its misshapen skull. It staggered, limbs shuddering uncontrollably. Another shot followed, and another, each impact jerking the creature's body violently. After the fifth shot, it collapsed, its impossibly articulated limbs folding beneath it. It lay twitching on the forest floor, dark fluid pooling around its body. The mouth opened and closed silently, those terrible eyes still fixed on me with malevolent intelligence. "Move back," the rifleman said, approaching cautiously with his weapon trained on the fallen creature. "These things don't die easy." I retreated several steps, watching as the man reached the creature's side. Without hesitation, he pressed the rifle muzzle directly against what remained of its head and fired a final time. The creature's body convulsed once, then went still. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by our ragged breathing. I stared at the dead thing, unable to process what had just happened, what I was seeing. The rifleman ejected the spent shell from his rifle, loaded a fresh round, and finally turned to face me. He was older than I'd first thought, maybe in his 50s, with a weathered face and gray-streaked beard. His clothes were worn, but practical, the gear of someone who spent serious time in the wilderness. His eyes, when they met mine, were hard, but not unkind. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough with exertion. I managed a nod, though okay was about the furthest thing from what I was feeling. "Name's Russell," he said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Russell Kearns." "Alex," I replied automatically. "Alex Wright." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. Russell nodded, then turned back to examine the creature. "Got yourself in a hell of a situation, Alex." What is that thing?" I asked, forcing myself to approach, to look more closely at what had nearly killed me. "Don't rightly know," Russell said. "Not officially, anyway. Old-timers in these parts called them skinwalkers or forest devils. Science types who've seen them don't have a name. At least, not one they'll admit to in public." I stared at the creature, trying to make sense of its anatomy now that I could look without fear. It seemed even more wrong in death, limbs bent at impossible angles, joints that shouldn't exist, that almost human face frozen in a rictus of rage. "You've seen them before," I said. It wasn't a question. Russell nodded grimly. "Third one I've had to put down. They don't usually come this far south. Something's driving them out of their territory." How did you find me?" "Heard the shots from the ranger station," he said. "I worked there part-time during hunting season. Was just closing up when I heard that noise it made, that screaming. Nothing natural makes a sound like that." I shuddered, remembering the pain that had lanced through my skull when the creature had made that terrible keening. "You're a long way from any marked trail," Russell continued, eyeing me speculatively. "What brought you out this far?" I explained about my solo camping trip, getting lost, finding the pool, the deer carcass being chased. Russell listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled as my story progressed. "The pool," he said when I finished. "Circular, still water, no plants growing around it?" I nodded. He spat on the ground. "They call that a devil's mirror around here. Old stories say they're doorways, places where the barrier is thin between our world and wherever these things come from." "You believe that?" I asked. Russell shrugged. "Doesn't much matter what I believe. What matters is knowing where they are and staying clear. You're lucky to be alive. Most folks who stumble across one of those pools don't make it back to tell about it." He glanced at the sky, where the first hints of dawn were lightening the eastern horizon. "Sun'll be up soon. We should head back. Rangers will want to know about this." "We're going to tell them?" I asked, surprised. "About this?" I gestured to the creature's body. Russell gave me a measuring look. "We'll tell them enough. That I found you lost in the woods, that we were attacked by a predator of some kind. They don't need to know details, and trust me, they don't want to." "They know, don't they?" I pressed. "The Rangers. They know these things exist." "Some do," Russell admitted. "The ones who've been here long enough. But knowing and acknowledging are different things. Official policy is to ignore, deny, and, if necessary, cover up." He knelt beside the creature and pulled my knife from its flank, wiping the black fluid on the grass before handing it back to me. "This is going to disappear," he said, nodding at the body. "By the time we bring anyone back here, there won't be anything to find." "How is that possible?" "These things, they don't last long once they're dead. Something about our world doesn't agree with them. They decay fast, real fast. By noon, there'll be nothing but a stain on the ground." I stared at him, trying to determine if he was serious. His expression left no doubt. "Let's go," Russell said, standing. "Dawn's the safest time to travel. These things hate direct sunlight. Probably why they stick to the densest parts of the forest." He led the way out of the clearing, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where he was. I followed close behind, unwilling to let more than a few feet separate us. "How far are we from the ranger station?" I asked, after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. "Couple miles," Russell replied without slowing. "We're taking a roundabout route, avoiding certain areas." "The pool," I guessed. He nodded. "And a few other places. This part of the forest has pockets, places where things ain't right. Best to give them a wide berth." We walked in silence for a while, the forest brightening around us as dawn gave way to full morning. Birds began to sing, insects buzzed, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Normal forest sounds that I had never appreciated so fully before. "You said this was the third one you've killed," I said eventually. "When was the first?" Russell's pace slowed slightly. 32 years ago. I was just a kid, really, 20 years old, working my first season as a junior ranger. Found one feeding on a group of hikers who'd gone missing. Shot it 6 times with my service revolver before it went down. And the rangers covered it up? Called it a bear attack. Closed that section of the forest for 6 months. By the time they reopened it, nature had reclaimed the site. No evidence left. And the second? 12 years back. Cabin on the north edge of the forest. Family of 4 torn apart. That one was bigger than this. Took a dozen rifle rounds to put it down. I shuddered, imagining a creature even larger than the one that had nearly killed me. "Why are you telling me this?" Russell stopped and turned to face me, his expression deadly serious. "Because you need to understand what's at stake. These things, whatever they are, they're getting bolder, coming closer to populated areas, attacking more frequently. Why? Don't know for sure. My guess, we're pushing deeper into their territory. Development, logging, climate change, all of it's disrupting whatever balance kept them in check before." He resumed walking, his pace more urgent now. "Listen carefully," he said over his shoulder. "When we reach the station, you follow my lead. We were hunting. Illegally, yes, but that's a minor offense compared to what they'd do if they thought you were spreading stories about monsters in Ocala. You got lost, I found you. We were attacked by what I believe was a Florida panther, but it ran off after I fired a warning shot." "They won't believe that," I protested. "Florida panthers are endangered, and they don't attack humans without provocation." "They'll believe it because it's easier than the alternative," Russell countered. "Nobody wants to admit there might be something in these woods that science can't explain, something that's been here longer than we have, and might still be here long after we're gone." We emerged from the trees onto a dirt road, the first sign of human presence I'd seen since becoming lost. About half a mile down the road, a small building came into view, the ranger station, a simple wooden structure with a metal roof and a radio antenna rising from one corner. Russell stopped again. "One more thing," he said, his voice low. "Don't come back here. Not ever. You've been marked now. They'll remember your scent, your footprints, the sound of your heartbeat. Next time, I might not be around to help." I nodded, a chill running down my spine despite the warming morning air. "I understand." "Good," Russell said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Now put on your best, scared but relieved face. We've got a performance to give." As we walked toward the ranger station, I realized with absolute certainty that Russell was right about one thing. I would never set foot in Ocala National Forest again. Some parts of the wilderness, I now understood, were never meant to be explored. Some things were better left undisturbed, unacknowledged, forgotten. But I also knew I would never forget what I had seen, what I now knew existed in the dark places of the world. That knowledge would stay with me forever, changing how I viewed the forests, the shadows, the spaces between things. I had gone looking for solitude and found something else entirely. A glimpse behind the veil of reality, a truth most people would never know and wouldn't want to know if given the choice. As Russell had said, I'd been marked. Not just physically, not just as prey for those forest devils, but marked in a deeper, more fundamental way. I had seen, and now I could never unsee. The ranger station door swung open as we approached, a uniformed figure stepping out onto the porch. Russell straightened his shoulders, adjusted his rifle strap, and whispered, "Showtime." I took a deep breath and followed him toward what I knew would be the first of many lies I would tell about what had happened in Ocala National Forest. Lies that, paradoxically, would protect a truth too terrible to acknowledge. The official report listed the incident as a wildlife encounter, specifically an aggressive Florida panther that fled after Russell fired a warning shot. My status changed from potentially missing hiker to located and safe, with a notation about camping without proper permits in a restricted area. I received a nominal fine, a stern lecture about wilderness safety, and a recommendation to stick to marked trails in the future. Russell played his part perfectly, the concerned part-time ranger who'd heard unusual sounds while closing up the station and gone to investigate. He downplayed his role in rescuing me, suggesting he'd merely happened upon me at an opportune moment. The senior ranger on duty, a heavy-set man named Gunderson with perpetually suspicious eyes, seemed eager to wrap up the paperwork and send us on our way. He asked few questions and appeared unsurprised by our answers, as if encounters like ours were routine occurrences he'd been trained to process efficiently and forget immediately. When Russell mentioned that my campsite was probably still set up near Hopkins Prairie, Gunderson offered to send someone to retrieve my gear. I started to provide directions, but Russell interrupted smoothly. "No need to trouble anyone," he said. "I'm off duty now, but I can show Alex back to his camp. Make sure he gets out of the forest safely." Gunderson seemed relieved by the suggestion. "Fine by me, just make sure you're both out by sundown. That section's technically closed for environmental assessment." As we left the station, I gave Russell a questioning look. He waited until we were out of earshot before explaining. "They'll sanitize your campsite if they find it," he said quietly. "Standard procedure after any unusual encounter. Anything you left there will disappear into an evidence locker somewhere, never to be seen again. But my car is probably already being processed. We'll check, but don't get your hopes up." He was right. When we reached the small clearing where I'd parked my sedan, it was gone. A yellow notice had been stapled to a nearby tree, indicating the vehicle had been towed for unauthorized parking in a protected area. Russell sighed. "They work fast. I can drive you to the impound lot in Ocala. You'll have to pay a fee, but you'll get your car back." "And my camping gear?" "Consider it lost. You can file a claim, but it'll be denied. No evidence of campsite found, they'll say." I nodded, resigned to the loss. The gear seemed insignificant compared to what I'd experienced, what I'd learned. Russell drove a battered Ford pickup that had seen better decades. The interior smelled of gun oil, tobacco, and pine. As we pulled away from the forest, I watched the trees recede in the side mirror, feeling both relief and a strange reluctance. Part of me wanted to go back, to investigate further, to understand what those things were and why they existed. Russell seemed to sense my thoughts. "Don't," he said simply. "Nothing good comes from digging into this. Trust me on that." "You've tried?" I asked. He was silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the rural highway stretching before us. "After the first one, yeah. Spent years researching, asking questions, looking for others who'd seen similar things. Nearly cost me my marriage, my job, my sanity." "Did you find anything?" "Fragments, pieces that don't quite fit together. Native American legends about skinwalkers and wendigos, colonial accounts of devil beasts in the unexplored territories, military reports from the 1950s about unidentified biological entities in national forests across the country, most heavily redacted." He glanced at me briefly. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that some things aren't meant to be understood. Not by us, anyway. We drove in silence for several miles after that, the Florida landscape rolling past, pine forests giving way to agricultural fields, then to the outskirts of Ocala itself. Finally, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me since our escape. "Why did you tell me? If it's so important to keep this secret, why share what you know?" Russell's weathered hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Because you're marked now," he said, echoing his earlier warning. "You deserve to know what that means." "And what does it mean, practically speaking?" He sighed heavily. "It means being careful, staying away from certain places, not just Ocala, but any old-growth forest with a history of disappearances. It means paying attention to your instincts, especially when they're telling you something isn't right. He paused, considering his next words carefully. It means understanding that the world is bigger, older, and stranger than most people ever realize. That the comfortable reality we've built for ourselves is just a thin veneer over something else. We reached the Ocala city limits, the rural highway widening into commercial strips lined with fast food restaurants and chain stores. Russell navigated through the traffic with practiced ease, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a diner. "You should eat something," he said. "After what you've been through, your body needs fuel." I realized suddenly that I was ravenous, having had nothing since yesterday's lunch. We entered the diner and found a booth in the back, far from other patrons. A waitress brought menus and coffee, hardly glancing at our dirt-smeared clothes and exhausted faces. After ordering a full breakfast for each of us, despite it being well past noon, Russell leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There's something else you should know," he said. "Something I've told exactly 3 other people in my life." I waited, sensing the importance of what would come next. "They're not alone out there," Russell continued. "There are others, people, organizations, who know about these things, who monitor them, study them, sometimes hunt them." "Government?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not officially. Maybe some black budget program buried so deep, even Congress doesn't know about it. But mostly private groups, individuals with resources and knowledge passed down through generations." "Like you?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I'm just a guy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, like you. Difference is, I've had 30 years to process what I saw, to learn what I could without drawing too much attention." Our food arrived and we ate in silence for several minutes. The normality of the diner, the clatter of plates, murmured conversations at other tables, sunlight streaming through windows, seemed surreal after the nightmarish events in the forest. "What do I do now?" I asked finally, pushing away my empty plate. Russell considered the question. "Go home. Resume your life. Try to forget if you can." "And if I can't?" He reached into his shirt pocket and extracted a small, worn business card. The only text on it was a phone number. No name, no company, no other identifying information. He slid it across the table. "If you start seeing things, shadows moving wrong, animals behaving strangely, recurring dreams about what happened, call this number. Tell whoever answers that Russell Kearns gave you the card. They'll know what it means." I took the card, turning it over to find the blank reverse side. Who are they? People who understand, who can help maybe, or at least give you the tools to protect yourself. "And if I don't need help? If I just move on?" Russell shrugged. "Then burn the card and count yourself lucky. Most people who've seen what you've seen don't get that option." After finishing our meal, Russell drove me to the impound lot where my car had been taken. As predicted, I had to pay a substantial fee to retrieve it. My camping gear was indeed missing, listed in the paperwork as evidence collected by Forest Service personnel. We stood beside my car, the afternoon sun beating down on the dusty impound lot. An awkward moment passed as we prepared to part ways, both aware that we shared knowledge few others possessed. "Thank you," I said finally, "for saving my life, for telling me the truth." Russell nodded, his weathered face solemn. "Be careful out there, Alex. Not just in the woods. Everywhere." "I will," I promised. He turned to go, then paused. "One last thing. You'll be tempted to research, to look for confirmation of what you saw. Natural response. But be careful where you look, what you say, who you tell. Some attention you don't want to attract." With that final warning, he walked back to his truck, got in, and drove away without looking back. I watched until his vehicle disappeared around a corner, then got into my own car and started the long drive home. That was 3 months ago. I've tried to follow Russell's advice, to resume my life, to move on, to forget. In some ways, I've succeeded. I go to work each day, interact with friends and family, maintain the routines that define a normal existence. But in other ways, I know I've changed irrevocably. I notice things now that I would have overlooked before. The way shadows sometimes seem to move independently of what casts them. The way certain animals, especially dogs, react to spaces where nothing is visible. The way some places feel wrong in ways I can't articulate but can definitely sense. I haven't used Russell's card, not yet, but I keep it in my wallet, checking occasionally to make sure it's still there. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I take it out and stare at that simple phone number, wondering who would answer if I called, what they would say, what they would ask of me. I don't go camping anymore, obviously. Don't hike either, not even on well-traveled paths in city parks. The thought of being surrounded by trees, of being watched by unseen eyes from dense vegetation, sends a cold shiver down my spine that I can't suppress. Sometimes I dream of the creature, its twisted limbs, its too wide mouth, those eyes that held an intelligence far older and colder than anything human. In the dreams, Russell doesn't arrive in time. In the dreams, the creature speaks to me as it tears me apart, telling me secrets about the world that no one should know. I wake from these dreams drenched in sweat, heart pounding, a scream caught in my throat. On those nights, I don't sleep again until dawn breaks and sunlight fills my bedroom. I've researched, despite Russell's warnings, carefully, using public computers and anonymous browsing, never leaving digital footprints that could be traced back to me. I've found snippets of information, fragments of stories from around the world and throughout history that might refer to creatures similar to what I encountered. Nothing definitive, nothing that would convince a skeptic, but enough to confirm what I already knew, that the thing in Ocala National Forest wasn't unique, wasn't isolated, wasn't a fluke of nature or a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. They're out there. They've always been out there. In the oldest forests, the deepest caves, the most remote mountains, watching, waiting, sometimes hunting. The modern world has pushed them back, confined them to shrinking territories, but they haven't gone extinct. They've adapted, learned to stay hidden, to strike only when discovery is unlikely or can be covered up. I wonder sometimes what would happen if one appeared in a city center, in broad daylight, with thousands of witnesses and countless cameras to record the event. Would the truth finally be acknowledged? Or would the machinery of denial and disinformation simply shift into higher gear? I suspect the latter. Humans are remarkably good at rejecting evidence that contradicts their understanding of reality. We build complex explanations to preserve our comfortable worldview, dismissing anything that threatens it as hoax, hallucination, or hysteria. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps most people aren't equipped to live with the knowledge that monsters are real, that they share our world, that the boundary between their reality and ours is thinner and more permeable than we'd like to believe. I certainly wasn't prepared. Even now, with months of distance and rationalization, I find myself startled by unexpected sounds, suspicious of dark corners, reluctant to be outdoors after sunset. The creature's final words to me, "We were here first," haunt me more than anything else. There's a terrible arrogance in humanity's assumption that we are the pinnacle of evolution, the rightful inheritors of this planet. What if we're just temporary custodians? What if something older, something more fundamental to Earth's ecology, is simply biding its time? I keep Russell's card close, a talisman against darker thoughts, a reminder that I'm not alone in what I know, what I've seen. I haven't called the number yet, but the possibility that I could provides a strange comfort. Sometimes, when the memories are particularly vivid, I take out the hunting knife I plunged into the creature's side. I cleaned it thoroughly after returning home, but when I hold it at certain angles under strong light, I can still see traces of dark residue in the groove where blade meets handle. Scientific curiosity suggests I should have it analyzed, but instinctive caution holds me back. Some knowledge comes at too high a price. For now, I live with my memories and my nightmares, with my research and my vigilance. I've moved my apartment from the first floor to the third, installed additional locks on all doors and windows, purchased a shotgun that I keep loaded and within reach while I sleep. Excessive precautions, perhaps. The creature is dead, and Ocala is hundreds of miles away. Yet I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, that my encounter in the forest was just the beginning of something larger, something I don't yet understand. Russell's warning echoes in my mind. "You've been marked now." Maybe he meant it literally, that the creature's kind would recognize me, hunt me if given the opportunity. Or maybe he meant something more metaphysical, that knowledge itself is a kind of mark, separating those who have glimpsed behind the veil from those who remain blissfully ignorant. Either way, I know I'll never see the world the same way again. Never walk through a forest without scanning the shadows, never hear an unusual sound without tensing, never fully trust that what I perceive as reality is complete or accurate. That's the real legacy of my camping trip to Ocala National Forest. Not the nightmares or the paranoia or the shotgun beside my bed, but the understanding that the world is larger, darker, and more mysterious than I ever imagined. That some questions are better left unasked. That some places are better left unexplored. And yet, despite everything, I find myself drawn to a different kind of wilderness now. Old libraries, obscure academic journals, ancient folklore collections. I'm searching for answers, for context, for anything that might help me understand what I encountered and why. Perhaps that's foolish. Perhaps Russell was right, and some things aren't meant to be understood. But I can't help myself. The creature awakened something in me, a hunger for truth that mirrors, in its own way, the hunger I saw in those inhuman eyes. For better or worse, I've been marked. And whatever that ultimately means, I know my life has been divided into two distinct periods. Before that night in Ocala National Forest and everything after. I only hope I live long enough to understand why. The sun was just beginning to dip below the treetops as I turned off the highway onto the unmarked dirt road. My old pickup bounced and rattled over the uneven surface, kicking up clouds of dust that billowed behind me. I cranked up the radio to drown out the unhealthy noises coming from the truck's aging engine. It had been a long drive from Albuquerque, and I was relieved to finally be reaching my destination, a remote cabin in the Gila National Forest of southwestern New Mexico, where I had taken a temporary job as a fire lookout for the summer. The isolation and solitude of the assignment appealed to me. I was at a crossroads in my life and needed to get away, clear my head, and figure out my next steps. At 32 years old, it felt like one setback after another had led me to this point. I'd struggled to hold down a steady job ever since getting laid off from the automotive plant. The anxiety and depression I'd battled on and off since my teens had resurfaced with a vengeance. My girlfriend of 5 years left, unable to cope with my withdrawn moods and our evaporating savings. Rock bottom was a 2 a.m. call from the county jail to bail out my brother Leo after his third DUI. Again, if I couldn't get my own life together, how was I supposed to keep being the one my family leaned on? So when my old high school buddy Gabe mentioned that the Forestry Service needed someone to man the tower at Willow Creek for a couple months, I jumped at the chance to drop off the grid and get paid for it. Maybe a summer in the wilderness finding myself was just what I needed. The truck lurched as the road deteriorated into little more than 2 ruts winding through the trees. Ponderosa pines towered on either side, a dense thicket that blocked out the fading light and any signs of civilization. I consulted the rough map the Forest Service had mailed me. If I was reading it right, the cabin should be just ahead. I rounded a bend, and there it was. A small log structure with a short tower on one end, barely visible in the shadows of the forest. I pulled to a stop, gravel crunching under the tires, and killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed down, a heavy stillness broken only by the ticking of the cooling motor. I grabbed my backpack and sleeping bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck. The cabin looked old but solidly built, its weathered timbers blending into the woods around it. Willow Creek burbled nearby, the faint sound of running water drifting through the trees. I circled around to the front and climbed the 3 creaky steps to the porch. The door was unlocked, just as the service had said it would be. I shouldered it open and peered into the dimness inside, waiting for my eyes to adjust. A main room held a cot, a desk and chair, a wood stove, and some shelves with a few pieces of mismatched dishware. A ladder led up to the lookout nest. Home sweet home for the next 2 months. I dropped my things on the cot, sending up a puff of dust, and headed back out to unload the rest of my gear from the truck. In multiple trips, I lugged in boxes of canned food, extra clothes, my hiking boots, some books, and my grandfather's old hunting rifle. By the time I was done, full dark had fallen, the stuffy cabin illuminated only by the meager glow of my flashlight. I was exhausted from the long drive but too jittery to sleep. I needed to walk off some energy, get my bearings, and breathe the cool night air. I pulled on a light jacket, slung the rifle over my shoulder out of habit more than any real concern, and headed out into the night. The darkness was absolute once I stepped away from the small circle of light cast by the open cabin door. No streetlights, passing headlights, or lit windows, just a thick, inky blackness that seemed to swallow sound as well as sight. I picked my way carefully through the trees, not wanting to venture too far, until I learned the lay of the land in daylight. The narrow beam of my flashlight swept over the underbrush, briefly catching a pair of green eyes that vanished between the trees. Some small nocturnal creature, startled by my passage. I walked until I reached the burbling creek, then followed it upstream a short way, enjoying the way the rushing water broke the heavy silence. Tomorrow I would hike up to the ridge for a look around, get myself oriented, maybe even do a bit of exploring. But for now, this was enough. I was already starting to feel more settled, the stress of the last few months fading into the background. I cut back toward the cabin, looking forward to a good night's sleep, when a flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision made me stop short. Something pale, darting between the distant trees. I swung my light toward it, but saw only the black trunks and motionless leaves, probably just a trick of the shadows. Get a grip, I chided myself. You're in the woods alone at night. Of course your mind is going to play. There it was again. Closer this time, just for an instant. But I was certain I saw it. Low to the ground, too large to be a rabbit or fox. Bipedal, and unnaturally pale. Every hair on my body stood on end. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, suddenly very glad to have its reassuring weight in my hands. "Hello," I called, hating the tremor in my voice. "Is someone there?" Silence. Even the crickets and frogs seemed to have gone quiet. My heart hammered in my throat as I scanned the trees, ready to pull the trigger at the slightest hint of a threat. Then, from the darkness just beyond the reach of my light, a voice, a raspy, sibilant whisper, the words strange and guttural, in no language I recognized. "Ana na hash yi nidishan naki adi." I felt the blood drain from my face. My finger tightened on the trigger. I opened my mouth to yell, to threaten, to demand the hidden speakers show themselves, but terror choked the words in my throat. Then the night erupted in a cacophony of howls, one long, undulating cry taken up and echoed by countless throats. Wolves, and close. Too close. I turned on my heel and ran. I didn't remember racing back to the cabin and barricading the door. I didn't remember jamming a chair under the handle, pressing my back against the rough wood, and sliding into a crouch as I hyperventilated, gulping air into lungs that felt bound with iron bands. The howling continued, the predatory chorus rising in pitch and volume until it was all I could hear, all I could process. Then, as abruptly as the unearthly cries had started, they cut off, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Fought to get my breathing back under control. Fought the urge to be sick on the unswept floorboards. What the hell was that? Not just the howls, but the figure in the woods? The one that whispered that gibberish right outside the range of my flashlight beam? Was any of it even real, or were the shadows and isolation already playing tricks on my sleep-deprived mind? No. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard, and whatever it was, it sure as shit wasn't human. My hands shook as I groped in the dark for the heavy kerosene lantern I'd lugged in earlier. I needed light, and the inadequate flashlight still grasped in my white-knuckled hand wasn't cutting it anymore. I finally got the lantern lit, filling the small cabin with flickering yellow light and long, jumping shadows. I stumbled to the cot and collapsed on the sagging mattress, the rifle still clutched to my chest. I wanted to block the door with something heavy, but the only real furniture was the bed, desk, and chair. My breathing was starting to even out, my galloping pulse gradually slowing as the adrenaline drained away, leaving me clammy and nauseous. Was the thing out there some kind of animal? There were still wolves in this part of New Mexico, I knew. Even a few scattered reports of mountain lions, although those sightings were pretty rare. But those pale, gangly limbs moving through the underbrush, some kind of emaciated bear, maybe. Except bears ran on all fours, and this thing had looked like it was on two legs, or trying to be. Those strange, harsh words hissed from the darkness, looped in my brain, over and over. An alien chant seared into my memory. I couldn't even begin to guess what language it was. Not Spanish? The only other one I had even a passing familiarity with. Maybe one of the local native dialects, or was I just losing my goddamn grip on reality after too many hours on the road? A low, guttural whine dragged me out of my spiral. The hair stood up on the back of my neck as I slowly pivoted towards the door. Something was scratching softly at the weathered wood, moving up and down like long claws or bony fingers, were dragging across the surface. Or antlers. I raised the rifle, sighting it at the door with shaking hands. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. "Show yourself." The scratching stopped. I held my breath, ears straining. An impossibly long, drawn-out moment of silence. Then a snuffling sound, like a beast scenting prey, and the creak of the old floorboards under a heavy weight. I braced for impact, for the door to splinter inward, for the nightmare to charge into the light. But the sounds moved away, receding into the night. I sagged in relief, all the strength draining from my limbs, but I didn't lower the rifle. I sank back onto the cot, every sense on high alert, jumping at every creak and rustle. I sat there until dawn, watching the gray light slowly seep through the cabin's single window, never taking my eyes off the door. When the bank terror finally loosened its hold enough for rational thought to filter back in, one thing crystallized in my mind with absolute, unshakable certainty. I needed to get the hell out of these woods. The old truck wouldn't start. Of course it wouldn't. After I left the damn thing idling for who knows how long last night, before finally remembering to shut it off. Now the battery was dead, and the sun climbing the sky as I yanked uselessly on the gear shift, muttering every swear word I could think of. There was no cell signal out here. No other way to call for help or let anyone know where I was. And walking out wasn't an option, not after what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I slammed my palms against the steering wheel in frustration, then froze. From outside the truck, carried on the morning breeze, came the echo of a distant scream. Or not a scream, exactly. The high, terrified bleating of an animal in distress. And it was coming from the direction of the cabin. I swallowed hard, my hand going to the rifle on the passenger seat. Shit. I grabbed the gun and slid out of the truck, eyes scanning the sun-dappled forest. Everything looked so deceptively normal in the light of day. Cheerful even. But every instinct was screaming at me to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever the hell was out there. The knot scream sounded again, followed by a splintering crash from inside the cabin. I spat out a curse and took off at a run, unslinging the rifle as I pounded up the steps and shouldered through the half-open door, and skidded to a shocked halt, the breath freezing in my lungs. The cot and desk were overturned, the shelves ripped out of the walls and spilling their contents across the floor. Claw marks gouged the wood, some of them stained with blood. And in the middle of the wreckage lay the mangled carcass of a deer. Its throat was torn out, its belly a gaping ruin of blood and viscera. The sightless eyes stared at me from its almost decapitated head. Thick ropes of saliva dripped from wolfish jaws. Not attached to any wolf I'd ever seen. The thing crouched over its grisly meal was canid in only the loosest sense, a twisted, elongated skeleton sheathed in pallid skin and patches of matted fur. Almost humanoid, but grotesquely deformed. It swung its skull-like head towards me as I stumbled back against the doorframe, lips peeling back from jagged fangs in a snarl. Not a wolf, not a bear. I didn't know what this thing was, but it sure as hell wasn't any animal that belonged in this world. A choked sound that was half horror, half hysterical laughter clawed its way out of my throat. Because there was no way. This wasn't possible. I was losing my mind. That had to be it. What else could explain? The thing lunged. I had a split-second impression of grasping, misshapen forearms, of emaciated ribs and jutting vertebrae, before it slammed into me with the force of a battering ram. I went down hard, the back of my skull cracking against the floor. The world grayed out for a moment, and I clawed my way back to consciousness, to the sensation of fetid breath washing over my face, of a heavy, stinking weight crushing my chest, of teeth snapping inches from my throat as I wedged the rifle between us and shoved with every ounce of panicked strength I possessed. The thing reared back, hissing. I sucked in a desperate lungful of air and rolled, somehow finding my feet. My hand scrabbled at my belt for my knife. A distant clinical part of my brain realized I must have dropped the gun when it tackled me, but there was no time to process that now. The thing whipped back towards me, milky eyes fixing on the blade. I had the distinct impression it was grinning. Then it spoke. Nijoiti, like father, like son. The words were mangled, barely recognizable, but I understood them. Ice flooded my veins. It knew me. Somehow, impossibly, this nightmare thing knew who I was, that I was Leo's brother, and that could only mean that thought, that horrible suspicion, was all the opening it needed. It launched itself at me, faster than anything that twisted had a right to be. Talon-tipped fingers clawed for my eyes. I ducked, slashed wildly with the knife, felt it connect, felt skin split and something hot and black spatter my face. The creature screeched and sprang back, one flailing elbow catching me across the jaw and sending me reeling. And in that instant, in the frozen moment between one heartbeat and the next, the thing seemed to ripple, to blur around the edges. The gaunt, inhuman form wavering like a mirage, like something wearing a skin not its own. Then the moment shattered, and it was on me again, jaws gaping, howling in rage and hate and hunger. I brought the knife up, bracing for impact. The crack of a rifle shot split the air. The thing's head snapped back, a hole appearing between its eyes, ichor spraying. It crumpled to the floor in a tangle of neck-snapped limbs. I stared wildly around the destroyed cabin, knife still raised. There, framed in the doorway, a smoking rifle clutched in his shaking hands, was Leo. His terrified eyes met mine over the spent weapon, wide and uncomprehending. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Ashki, he managed in a strangled whisper. What the fuck? Leo lowered the rifle slowly, like he expected the twisted body at our feet to spring back to life any second. That made two of us. Some distant, numb part of me wondered what the hell my brother was even doing here. Last I'd heard, he was still in county lockup awaiting trial for his latest DUI. I tore my eyes away from the thing and let the hand holding my knife drop to my side. I was shaking all over, I realized dimly. I swallowed, tasting blood and bile. Leo, I croaked. How? What? The words wouldn't come. Nothing made sense. It was like the entire world had tilted on its axis, leaving nightmare logic in its wake. He picked his way through the splinters and gore littering the floor, skirting the dead thing in a wide arc, until he reached my side. His face was white under the usual scruff, eyes hunted. I'd seen my brother scared plenty of times over the years, scared of our old man in one of his drunken rages, scared of the looming specter of jail time. But I'd never seen Leo scared like this. This was something deeper, something primal. The rifle barrel sagged as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. His free hand landed on my shoulder and gripped hard. Some ghostly echo of all the times he'd tried to shove me behind him when we were kids, and the threat of violence was in the air. You okay? His voice was hoarse, choked. I nodded mechanically. Okay was so far from what I was, it was almost laughable. But I was alive. At least there was that. What is that thing, Leo? The words came out small, lost. What's happening? He looked at the corpse, swallowed, looked away. Not here, we need to go, now. He scooped up my fallen rifle and shoved it into my numb hands, started pulling me towards the door. I stumbled after him, my body operating on autopilot. The cool morning air hit my face as we stepped out into the too bright sun, and it was like being doused in icy water. I flinched, half expecting some fresh horror to come leaping out of the trees. But the woods were still, quiet. Leo hauled me over to a Jeep I didn't recognize parked haphazardly next to my dead truck. He ripped open the passenger side door and all but shoved me in, then ran around and vaulted behind the wheel. The engine roared to life, and then we were bouncing down the rutted access road, fleeing the cabin and its horrors behind us. I twisted around to stare out the back window, watching the nightmarish scene recede. Leo, seriously, what the fuck? Not now, he snapped, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Just let me get us somewhere safe first, then I'll explain everything. Safe. The word almost made me laugh again, teetering on the edge of hysteria. Was anywhere safe from that thing? From what it represented? We jounced around a switchback, the cabin vanishing behind a screen of trees. I faced forward again, tried to keep my eyes fixed on the winding dirt road ahead instead of my brother's ashen profile. Tried not to see the blood. My blood splashed across the side of his face. I don't know how long we drove. The old mining roads that snaked through this part of the Gila twisted back on themselves, wending aimlessly to nowhere. By the time Leo finally slowed and pulled off into a small clearing, the sun had climbed to its apex, bathing everything in blinding, merciless light. He killed the engine, and we sat for a long moment, the ticking of the cooling metal the only sound. The events of the last 12 hours felt surreal, impossible, but the acrid tang of fear sweat sticking my shirt to my back was real. The throb of the bruises and scrapes I'd collected was real. The blood drying on my hands was very, very real. Leo blew out a slow breath, then twisted to rummage behind the seats. He came up with a filthy towel and a first aid kit and started methodically cleaning and bandaging my wounds. His hands shook slightly as he worked, but his touch was gentle, careful. Leo, I finally managed. My voice cracked. I'd bitten my tongue at some point, I realized. Swallowed blood. What the hell is going on? What was that thing? He sat back, not quite meeting my eyes. The rifle lay across his knees, his fingers light on the trigger guard, like he was reassuring himself it was still there. Something that shouldn't exist, he said quietly after a long moment. Something wrong. He looked at me then, and the expression on his face made my stomach clench. It's a skinwalker, Ash. The word slammed into me, drove the air from my lungs. Skinwalker, ye nald lushi. The witches of Navajo legend, evil medicine men who could take the form of animals, twist them into something monstrous. But that was myth. Campfire stories to scare kids. Not something real, something solid enough to rip out a deer's throat, to attack me, to know my name. But even as I reeled, some part of me whispered that it was true, that on some gut-deep level, I'd known. That hissed voice in the dark, speaking words I shouldn't have understood. I'm watching you in the old language. The same tongue my grandfather had used when he told us the stories of Coyote and the hero twins by the fire. Stories of skinwalkers loping through the night, hungering for human flesh. My fingers knotted in my shirt over my pounding heart. Questions clamored in my skull, but I forced them down, made myself focus on the most immediate, the most urgent. How did you know? I asked hoarsely. How did you know to come after me? And because fear had sharpened me, let me see the shape of things that had been hidden. What did you do, Leo? An expression I couldn't read flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or something darker. He looked away, jaw clenching. I didn't know, he said after a minute. Not for sure, but I had a feeling. He huffed a humorless laugh. A real bad feeling. I waited. The skin between my shoulder blades crawled. I got out of county 2 days ago, he finally said. He was still avoiding my eyes. Good behavior, overcrowding, whatever. I didn't ask questions. Just wanted to put it behind me, you know? Try to get my shit together. He scrubbed a hand over his stubbled face. I went to see grandfather. Thought he might have some words of wisdom, one fuck up to another. Our grandfather, Henry Blackwater, was a good man. A medicine man, a healer. He'd tried his best with Leo and me growing up, even though we were only a quarter Navajo on our mom's side and not born to the people. Tried to keep us connected to our roots, our heritage. We sat up late talking, Leo went on. He told me the skinwalkers were back. I stared at my brother. The crawling sensation intensified, icy fingers walking up my spine. What do you mean, back? I mean back, awake. When the uranium mines closed down all those years ago, a lot of the traditional barriers and warning signs were destroyed. A lot of the old warding ways were lost. His jaw worked. The things that were buried there, trapped there, they got loose. My mind reeled. The old uranium mines that had operated all through the Grant's mineral belt back in the 50s, poisoning the land and water, leaving behind radioactive tailings and gaping wounds in the earth, scars that would never heal, scars that ran deep through the Navajo Nation, scars that hid worse things than toxic waste, apparently. Grandfather fought them when he was young, Leo said. Learned the rituals, the prayers, the sacrifices to bind them again. But there was one he could never fully chain, one who knew how to hide from the cleansing, burrowing deeper and deeper into the dark. His eyes met mine, haunted, one who hungered more than the others. I thought of that pale, gangrel thing crouching over the deer in the cabin, the ruin of its face, the milky void of its eyes, the skeletal grin as it watched me scrabble for my knife. It took one of his brothers, Leo whispered, took his shape for a while, until Grandfather drove it out, sent it fleeing into the night. But not before it swore vengeance, not before it vowed to devour our bloodline to the last. His hands twisted together, white-knuckled. I watched him, numb. This was insane, impossible. Except it wasn't, was it? I had the bruises, the terror sweat still trickling down my back to prove it. Grandfather bound it as best he could, Leo said, drove it into the deep places, the dark places, and wove what wards he knew to hold it. It wasn't enough, but it was all he could do. All he could hope for was that it would sleep, maybe forever. He took a shaking breath, let it out. But it didn't sleep forever, Ash. It woke up. I licked my dry lips, found my voice. How long? 3 months. 3 months since it started stalking the res. 3 months of pets going missing, livestock mutilated, of people vanishing in the night, only to turn up days later with their throats torn out. I swallowed. That thing in the cabin had been strong, vicious, but it hadn't felt like the apex predator Leo was describing, a monster out of legend. It had felt lesser somehow, like an echo of a deeper darkness, like a cub to a she-wolf. That wasn't the skinwalker, I said slowly. Realization was a lead weight in my chest. Was it? Leo looked at me. There was grief in his eyes and a terrible knowing. No, he said softly. It wasn't. That was its its offspring, its child. And if it had come for me, specifically sought me out, then that could only mean Grandfather did a ritual, Leo said. Every word sounded like it was being dragged out of him. A way to see if the skinwalker's taint had taken hold in any of us, in the family. He swallowed convulsively. It showed him 2 things. You, alone in a dark wood, lost and afraid. And you, I finished. Cold certainty settled in my bones. It showed him you. He squeezed his eyes shut, nodded once, jerkily. I went out to the res to clear my head, get my bearings. I don't know what I thought. That I could reason with it, maybe. Make it understand that I didn't want. His voice cracked. I swear, Ash, I swear on our mother's grave, I never meant for this. I didn't know what it would do, what it was capable of. But I was putting the pieces together now, the fractured shards of my memory clicking into place. That final DUI. The night I'd gotten the call to come bail Leo out of county yet again. He'd been raving when I picked him up, eyes fever bright, words tumbling out of him in a barely coherent flood, begging me to believe him, begging me to run. I hadn't listened, hadn't wanted to listen. I'd been so damn tired, so sick of his bullshit excuses and lies. And when he'd grabbed me, fingers digging into my arms, a sudden rush of rage had surged up in me, vicious and hot. I'd shoved him away, heard his head crack against the cinder block wall. Only it hadn't been rage I'd felt in that moment, had it? It had been something else, something hungry, something old and cruel, scenting weakness, opportunity, the thing that had always lived in my brother's shadow, waiting, watching. I met Leo's eyes, saw my own horror reflected back at me. It's not your fault, I said. The words were ashes in my mouth. You didn't know. But some part of him had. Some instinct beyond conscious thought had sent him tearing out of county lockup and halfway across the state, following a pull he couldn't name, trying to put himself between his little brother and the nightmare wearing his face. And I hadn't listened. We have to stop it, I said. Determination steadied my voice, my hands. We have to stop it, Leo, before it hurts anyone else. Before I hurt anyone else, I didn't say, but he heard it anyway. "We will," he said. He reached out, gripped my shoulder. "I promise, Ash. We'll find a way." I nodded, tried to smile. It felt like a rictus grin stretching my face. "Well then, let's go hunting." We hiked. Leo had an old topo map of the Gila, its creases soft and worn from years of folding and unfolding. The skinwalker's territory was marked out in his crabbed handwriting, a loose circle of red pen centered on the old uranium mine, the place where it had first broken free. My brother took the lead as we trudged through the underbrush, following game trails and dry streambeds. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, ignored the low simmer of anxiety in my gut. Out here in the bright of day, away from the immediate memory of blood and screaming, it was almost possible to convince myself that this was just another backcountry campout. Just two brothers on a hike, a perfectly normal excursion. Except for the rifles slung over our shoulders and the knives at our belts. Except for the way Leo would freeze at every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, his hand twitching towards the gun. Except for the certainty sinking lead-heavy into my bones with every step. The thing stalking these woods, the thing that had spawned the pale mockery currently cooling on the cabin floor, it knew we were coming for it. It was waiting for us. For me. I didn't have words for the dread that gripped me every time that thought surfaced, cold and inexorable as the tide. It wasn't just fear of the creature itself, of the ancient hunger and malice that rode its bones. It was fear of the part of me that called to that hunger, the part that wanted to sink into it, drown in it, become it. I shoved those thoughts down deep and locked them away, focused on the weight of the rifle in my hands, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, the sun beating down on the back of my neck as it arced across the cloudless sky. We walked, time stretched and warped, the minutes bleeding together. My shirt was soaked with sweat, sticking to my back. I was just about to call for a water break when Leo held up a closed fist. "Halt!" I stumbled to a stop, heart suddenly pounding against my ribs. He stood utterly still, head cocked, listening. I strained my ears past the drum of my own pulse but heard nothing. No bird calls, no insect buzz. The forest was preternaturally hushed. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath, and then, drifting on that breathless stillness, a distant scream. Every hair on my body stood on end. It was a woman's scream, high and shrill with terror, and it was coming from directly ahead of us, from the direction of the mine. Leo shot me a look, lips pressed into a bloodless line. I nodded once, sharply. We moved. The scream cut off as abruptly as a snapped thread, but neither of us slowed our headlong rush. Low branches whipped at my face, snatched at my clothes. I batted them away, barely feeling the sting of the cuts they left behind. My blood roared in my ears, narrowing my vision to a tunnel. We burst into a small clearing and then jerked to a halt, panting. I could see the black mouth of the mine up ahead, a wound in the earth ringed by scrub grass and tumbled rocks. And there, at the edge of that abyss, a crumpled figure, face down, limbs askew, not moving. Leo raised his rifle to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel. I slid my knife from its sheath, gripping it in a sweat-slick hand. "Help me." The words drifted to us on the dead air, soft and wavering, lost. "Please." The figure stirred, pushed itself up on trembling arms. A curtain of dark hair fell away from a pale, blood-streaked face. A girl, no more than 20, wearing clothes that had been clawed to ribbons. She stared at us with huge, haunted eyes, her breath coming in shallow pants. "Please," she whispered again. Fresh blood dripped from the torn skin of her throat. I took a half-step forward. Leo grabbed my arm, hard. "Wait," he breathed. "Something's not right." I shot him an incredulous look. Of course something wasn't right. There was an injured girl bleeding out in front of us. We had to help her. I froze. Ice trickled down my spine as realization crashed over me. Not a girl, bait. The thing burst from the mine entrance in a blur of motion, a lupine shape of knotted muscle and matted fur. No, not lupine. Something more, something worse. Its body twisted and reshaped by the unnatural energy thrumming through it. Jaws that split back too far, exposing rows of jagged teeth. Limbs too long, too fluid, tipped with serrated claws that gouged furrows in the rocky soil. It threw back its head and screamed, an ululating cry that shattered the air like glass. And as the sound reached me, something deep in my brain lit up in response. A match set to a pool of gasoline. Hunger roared through me, vicious and bottomless, and for a vertigo instant I saw the world through its eyes. Prey, threat, food, hate, kill. I staggered back, my vision shifting and blurring at the edges. The skinwalker's scream echoed in my skull, brutal and deafening. I felt my lips peel back from my teeth in a feral snarl, my fingers twisting into claws. Ash! Leo's shout cut through the fog, snapped me back to myself. I blinked, saw his stricken face swim into focus. The girl, the thing that looked like a girl, was grinning. Its smile stretched too wide, the skin splitting at the corners to show the black gums underneath. "Welcome home, little brother," it said in a voice like old leaves skittering over stone. "We've been waiting for you." Bile rose in my throat. I wanted to scream, to weep, to claw the tainted blood from my veins. But there was no time, no space for any of that, because the skinwalker was lunging, its bulk hurtling across the clearing faster than anything that size had a right to move. Leo fired. The report was deafening in the hushed woods, the muzzle flash briefly painting the creature's snarling face in hellish light. It didn't slow, didn't falter. If anything, the bullet seemed to enrage it. It bunched its haunches and sprang, a nightmare given fang and sinew and claw. I had a panicked instant to register how huge it was, how utterly outmatched we were, before it slammed into my brother with the force of a freight train. They went down in a thrashing tangle, the rifle spinning away into the underbrush. The thing that had been a girl was laughing, a crazed, gurgling sound, black blood foaming over its chin. I wrenched my knife free of its sheath, launched myself at the skinwalker's heaving back. Dimly heard Leo's pained shout, felt the wet snap of breaking bone as they rolled across the rocky ground. Then I was on it, somehow astride it, my blade sinking into the thick ruff of its neck. It screamed, convulsed, threw me like a ragdoll. I hit the ground hard, fetched up against a deadfall with an impact that drove the air from my lungs. Through the gray haze filming my vision, I saw the skinwalker rear back from Leo's prone form, saw my brother's blood sheeting its muzzle, saw it turn its head, slowly, until that awful crimson gaze found me. Pinned me like an insect, its shoulders bunched, its jaws opened. I scrabbled for my dropped knife, my shaking fingers closing on empty air. I was going to die here, I realized with a numb sort of clarity. I was going to die. And then that thing wearing my face was going to shuck its stolen skin and walk out of these woods wearing mine. The skinwalker growled, a low, curdling sound that vibrated in my bones, took one step towards me, another. Behind it, unseen, Leo dragged himself up onto his knees. His face was a mask of blood, his left arm hanging at a grotesque angle. But his right hand closed on the fallen rifle, his split lip pulling back from bloody teeth in a rictus snarl. The skinwalker lunged. I braced for the impact, for the feel of its teeth in my throat. And Leo fired. The bullet took the creature in the side of its skull, punching through hide and bone in a spray of gore. It staggered, its head whipping around, jaws snapping at empty air. Leo fired again. Again. 3 holes bloomed in the matted fur of its chest, weeping sluggish runnels of blackish blood. It took 1 step, 2, snarled through a ruined throat. Then slowly, so slowly, it toppled, fell like a felled tree, and lay still. The crumpled thing that had been a girl wasn't smiling anymore. It made a choked, gargling sound, convulsed once. Then it too went limp, the light fading from its filming eyes. Silence. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I stared at the bodies, my heart a jackhammer against my ribs, waiting for them to twitch, to rise, to turn on us with renewed savagery. But they stayed dead, cooling and leaking their black ichor into the thirsty soil. It was over. We'd won. And all I could think was, what now? What did winning even mean when the evil had already sunk its hooks into my very blood and bones? When I could feel it coiled there still, cold and patient, waiting for me to stumble? To fall? I didn't realize I was weeping until Leo's good arm came around my shoulders, until he grunted in pain as he pulled me close against his side. I buried my face in his jacket, breathed in the familiar scent of sweat and leather and the copper tang of blood. "It's all right," he said hoarsely. He squeezed me tight, ignoring the wet snap as his broken arm shifted. "We're all right, Ash, it's finished." But I knew better, knew it in the marrow of my bones, in the chill hollow behind my eyes that still yearned towards spilled blood and screaming. The skinwalker was dead, its get were dead. But the sickness they carried, the gnawing hunger that had burrowed into my core and nested there, claws sunk deep into the secret meat of my heart, that would never be finished, would never let me rest, never grant me peace. I could feel it even now, rattling against the cage of my ribs, waiting, watching, whispering in the dark. My name is Ahanu, which means he fights in the language of my Cherokee ancestors. But I've spent most of my life trying to avoid confrontation. That's part of why I took this job as a park ranger, patrolling the vast expanses of wilderness in Wenatchee National Forest. I wanted to get away from the noise and chaos of the city, from the constant reminders of my failed marriage and mounting debts. Out here, among the towering evergreens and craggy peaks, I finally found a measure of peace. At least that's what I thought. But there are older, darker things that dwell in these ancient woods, forces that have existed long before man ever set foot here. And now I fear I've awoken one of them. It started with the reports of missing hikers. Every year we get a handful of folks who wander off trail and lose their way. Most of the time we find them within a day or two, hungry and dehydrated, but no worse for wear. But this was different. In the past month, a dozen people have vanished without a trace, swallowed up by the ravenous forest. The other rangers and I have searched high and low, combing every inch of the 1.7 million acre woods. But not a single clue has turned up. It's as if they were plucked from the earth by some unseen force. The local Wenatchee tribe whispers of an ancient evil that lives in the heart of the forest. They call it Skinwalker, a malevolent, shape-shifting spirit, neither animal nor man. For generations they've warned against venturing too deep into Skinwalker's territory. But their ancestral wisdom carries little weight these days. The world has moved on, dismissing their beliefs as silly native superstitions. I'm not sure what to believe anymore. My rational mind rebels against the idea of spirits and monsters, and yet I cannot shake the deep sense of unease that has settled into my bones. Each night, I toss and turn in my small cabin, unable to sleep, my dreams haunted by twisted images of grasping branches and unseeing eyes. Something is out there in woods, watching and waiting. I can feel its presence, like a splinter in my mind, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the call came in. Another hiker gone missing, this time a young woman named Jessica Hartman. She'd set out alone to summit Dirty Face Peak 2 days ago. Her roommate got worried when she never made it home and wasn't responding to texts. I splashed cold water on my face and downed a cup of black coffee before heading out to join the search party. With each passing disappearance, a sense of grim resignation had settled over the ranger station. We still went through the motions, but I could see it in the empty eyes and tight jaws of my co-workers, the unspoken acknowledgement that we were fighting a losing battle against an enemy we didn't understand. The mood was somber as our convoy of SUVs wound its way up the narrow dirt roads, pale beams of headlights barely cutting through the gray pre-dawn gloom. Fallen leaves twirled and eddied in our wake. Summer had passed into autumn seemingly overnight, the vibrant greens of the forest canopy fading into muted shades of ochre and rust. The season of death was upon us. We established a base camp on a ridge near the trailhead and split up into teams to cover more ground. I set out alone, the crunch of my footfalls muted by the thick carpet of humus. An unearthly quiet suffused the woods, the usual chirps and chatter of wildlife replaced by an oppressive stillness. Only the soft sighing of the wind through bare branches broke the silence. I followed the trail as it switchbacked up a steep slope, stopping periodically to scan the understory for any sign of disturbance. It was grueling work, and sweat plastered my uniform to my back despite the chill in the air. With each fruitless hour that ticked by, a seething frustration built in my gut. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't quell the feeling that Jessica was still out here somewhere, waiting for me to find her, that I was her only hope. Around midday, I crested a rise and found myself at the edge of a small clearing. Sunlight lanced down through a gap in the branches above, casting the glade in an eerie, vaguely unsettling glow. That's when I saw it. There, nearly concealed in the deep shadows at the base of a massive gnarled oak tree, was the tattered remains of a light blue backpack, a trail of my own. With a rising sense of trepidation, I approached the tree. Up close, I could see that the backpack had been shredded, torn apart by what appeared to be jagged claws. Viscous, dark liquid stained the nylon, and a few strands of long blonde hair clung to the zipper. No doubt it was Jessica's pack. I took a shaky breath, trying to quell the panic rising up in my throat. I knew I should radio this in, call for backup, but some reckless impulse compelled me forward. I had to know what happened to her. I spotted a disturbance in the undergrowth, leading away from the clearing. Snapped branches and trampled vegetation cut a swath through the forest, as if something large had crashed through in a frenzy. Heart-pounding, I followed the makeshift path deeper into the woods, blood roaring in my ears. The rational part of my brain screamed for me to turn back, but it was drowned out by a mounting sense of dread. I felt like I was being pulled along on a string, an inexorable force drawing me onward to some dark revelation. The trail ended abruptly at the mouth of a small cave. A black void cut into the hillside. Musty, stale air wafted out from the depths, carrying with it an unidentifiable stench that made my gorge rise. Every instinct urged me to flee, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I knew I couldn't turn back now, not without answers. With trembling fingers, I unclipped the flashlight from my belt and flicked it on. The weak beam did little to penetrate the gloom. Steeling myself, I ducked into the low entrance of the cave, the dank chill lifting goosebumps on my arms. The smell grew stronger as I pushed deeper into the bowels of the earth. It was a noxious melange of decay and ammonia, like a slaughterhouse floor. The tunnel twisted and turned, the uneven floor threatening to turn an ankle with each step. Oily water dripped from the ceiling, pattering onto my head and shoulders. Suddenly the walls fell away and I found myself standing in a small chamber. As my light swept the room, the beam froze on a huddled shape in the corner. Bile burned the back of my throat. It was Jessica, or rather, what was left of her. Her body had been mangled, nearly beyond recognition, limbs bent at unnatural angles, her abdomen a gaping ruin of tattered flesh. Clouded, lifeless eyes stared out from a face frozen in a rictus of terror, and all around her, covering the earthen walls and floor, was a latticework of deep, ragged gouges, claw marks. I expelled the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding in an explosive gasp, and, in that moment of stunned horror, I glimpsed a movement in my peripheral vision. Something huge and dark, detaching itself from shadow. Something with gleaming yellow eyes and far, far too many teeth. A scream locked behind my ribs as I spun to face the creature, but it was too late. An enormous, furred shape lunged from the darkness in a blur of rippling muscle and flashing claws. The last thing I saw was a cascading tangle of matted fur and the glint of canine teeth as long as my forearm. Then a crushing weight slammed into my chest, and the world went black. Consciousness returned slowly, a gradual surfacing from the depths of oblivion. The first thing I became aware of was pain, a deep, pervasive ache that radiated through my entire body. It felt like I'd been run over by a truck. I tried to move and instantly regretted it as a lance of agony tore through my skull. The coppery taste of blood coated my tongue. Gingerly, I reached up to probe the tender spot on the back of my head. My fingers came away sticky and red. It took a few moments for the memories to come flooding back. The cave, Jessica's mutilated corpse, the attack. I bolted upright, adrenaline overriding the throbbing in my temples. I had to get out of here, had to warn the others about what I'd seen, but as I staggered to my feet, I realized I was no longer in the cave. I found myself standing in the center of a small grove, the trees pressing close on all sides like a living wall. The air was preternaturally still, without even the faintest whisper of a breeze. An unnatural, sourceless light suffused the clearing, casting no shadows. It was deeply, profoundly wrong. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were carved into the trunks of the surrounding trees, intricate spirals and jagged runes that seemed to writhe and dance in the eerie glow. Some small, detached part of my brain recognized them as similar to the claw marks from the cave. As I turned in a slow circle, ice settled into the pit of my stomach. I was in the heart of Skinwalker's lair. A guttural growl sounded from the trees behind me. I whirled around to see the creature emerging from the brush. It moved with a sinuous, lupine grace, muscles rippling beneath a pelt of shaggy sable fur. Baleful yellow eyes bored into mine with a shocking intelligence, and its lips curled back to reveal a mouthful of dagger-like teeth. In that moment, I knew with sickening certainty that I was going to die. There was no escape, no fighting this thing. It would toy with me, savoring my terror, before ripping me apart like it had Jessica. Despair crashed over me, and I sank to my knees, legs no longer able to support my weight. As if sensing my surrender, Skinwalker stalked closer, a low rumble building in its cavernous chest. It began to pace around me in a tightening spiral. There was an almost ritualistic feel to its movements, like a predator performing some primal, pre-kill rite. The growl deepened, black lips peeling back to expose pink gums. With dreamlike calm, I watched as the creature tensed, coiling to spring, the inevitability of my own death washing over me. A distant part of me hoped it would be quick. Then Skinwalker launched itself at me in a flash of obsidian fur and ivory fangs. Knowing it was futile, I reflexively threw my arms up in front of my face, and the world exploded in a blaze of searing, agonizing pain. When I opened my eyes again, Skinwalker was gone. Only the shredded, bloody remains of my uniform bore mute testimony to the attack. Somehow, impossibly, I was still alive. I stared at the ravaged flesh of my forearms, the skin flayed to ribbons. Already the wounds were scabbing over, an angry red lattice of scar tissue knitting together before my disbelieving eyes. I felt different. A howling maelstrom of savage, primal emotion boiled in my veins, rage and hunger and bloodlust tangled into a snarling Gordian knot. It was as if a switch had been flipped deep in my lizard brain, some long-dormant aspect of my psyche dragged howling into the light. With rising panic, I realized what had happened, what Skinwalker had done to me. The old stories spoke of how the creature could infect others with its curse, either through a bite or a slash from its venomous claws, how it would transform them, twist them into its own image. I stumbled to my feet, staring down at my hands like they belonged to a stranger. My fingers had elongated into sharp, black-nailed claws. Coarse fur sprouted from my skin in patches. I could feel my bones shifting, warping beneath my flesh, muscles wrenching into new configurations. A scream tore itself from my throat, then deepened, roughened into an animalistic roar. Frantic, I cast about desperately for something, anything that could stop the change overtaking me. My gaze fell upon a gleam of silver in the dirt, my ranger badge, torn free during the attack. I snatched it up, the metal searing my skin like a brand. An idea born of blind panic and the last vestiges of my fading humanity seized me. I pressed the silver badge to my chest, gritting my teeth against the agonizing burn. Smoke curled up from my flesh, the stink of charred meat filling my nostrils. But I held it there, digging it in deeper, using the pain to tether me to my sense of self. I focused on my life before all of this, on who I was, a man, a ranger, a Hanu. I clung to my identity like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline, and, miraculously, it seemed to help. I could feel the beast within me receding, the tide of feral savagery slowly ebbing away. My heartbeat slowed, the world coming back into focus. I took a deep, shuddering breath, then another, each one a battle. The change had stopped, held at bay for the moment. But for how long? With the immediacy of the crisis past, my mind began to race. I couldn't go back, not like this, not with this thing inside me. My life, my humanity had been ripped away, replaced by a monster wearing my skin. What was I now? How long until this reprieve failed, until I lost control? How many more would die at my hands? No, there was only one choice. I had to end this, had to destroy the curse at its source. I knew where I needed to go, what I had to do, even as some part of me quailed at the thought. I turned to face the direction of the cave, of Skinwalker. Silver badge still clutched to my chest, I ran. I don't know how long or how far I ran. Time lost all meaning, the individual moments bleeding together, until all that existed was the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the forest floor, the ragged sawing of my breath in my lungs. The curse imbued me with inhuman strength and speed, the trees blurring past in a smear of indistinct shapes. But even as my body hurtled forward, my mind raced along other tracks. Images strobed behind my eyelids. Jessica's sightless, staring eyes, the malevolent hunger in Skinwalker's gaze as it paced around me, the way my hands had warped into talons. Was this how it would end for me? As a feral, slavering beast, my humanity scoured away until nothing remained but an insatiable appetite for violence? The thought sent a spike of despair lancing through me. At some point, without my conscious direction, my headlong flight had turned towards the cave where this had all begun, where Jessica had met her grisly demise. Some primal instinct, some dark intuition, told me that Skinwalker would be there, that it would be waiting for me. The curse called to its creator like a beacon, and I could no more resist its pull than I could command the tides. As I drew closer, a grim resolve settled over me, cold and implacable as a glacier. I would put an end to this one way or another. Either I would destroy the creature that had taken everything from me, or I would die in the attempt. There could be no other outcome. I welcomed the icy certainty. It was clean and pure in its simplicity, cutting through the chaos of fear and pain and guilt roiling inside me. The yawning black mouth of the cave loomed ahead, and I slowed to a halt at its entrance. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this place of horror and death. But I quashed the fear ruthlessly. I had come too far to turn back now. The stench of carrion billowed out to greet me as I stepped into the darkness. The reek of rotting flesh so thick I could almost taste it on the back of my tongue. In the absolute blackness, my other senses sharpened to preternatural acuity. I could hear the scrabbling of tiny claws on stone, the drip of water, the thundering cadence of my own heartbeat, and beneath it all, a low, guttural growl that echoed from the depths of the cave. Skinwalker. I reached out with senses I didn't fully understand, felt the creature's presence uncoiling in the dark like an oily shadow. It had been waiting for me, just as I'd known it would be. I could feel the weight of its gaze, the cruel amusement and anticipation that seethed behind those glowing yellow eyes. "I'm here," I called out, my voice steady despite the fear that thrummed through me like a live wire. "Show yourself, you bastard." A rumbling growl was my only answer, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, rebounding off the close confines of the cave until I was bathed in it. Then a patch of shadow detached from the wall and prowled forward, resolving into a nightmarish silhouette of hulking muscle and matted fur, and far, far too many teeth. I raised my silver badge before me like a talisman, the metal cool and solid in my grip. I poured every ounce of determination, of defiance into that gesture, brandishing it like a weapon. The badge had halted the curse's progression before. I could only pray it would prove an effective defense now, here at the heart of Skinwalker's domain. The creature stalked ever closer, its eyes lambent in the gloom, its strides unhurried and confident. I braced myself, preparing to dodge, to strike, to do anything to keep those scythe-like claws from finding my flesh again. But the attack never came. Instead, Skinwalker paused just outside the radius of my outstretched badge, lip curling to bare its fangs in a lupine approximation of a smirk. Then, to my horror, it began to change, its form rippling and flowing like mercury. Fur and snout and claws melted away, replaced by smooth copper skin and long dark hair. In the space of a heartbeat, the monster was gone. In its place stood a man, lean and naked, corded muscle moving beneath his skin like a snake coiling beneath the surface of still water. His features were sharp and angular, with high, prominent cheekbones and a blade of a nose. He looked like the missing link between man and wolf, feral and wild. Glittering black eyes stared out from that chiseled face, ancient and inhuman. My badge slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. This was so far beyond anything I had expected, anything I thought I understood. What was this thing, this creature that could wear the skin of man or beast? Was it a spirit, a demon? Something older and hungrier and more terrible than I could possibly imagine. What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice strangled. The man, the skinwalker, smiled, a slash of white in the dark. When he spoke, his words were rust and gravel. "I am the hunter," he said, his eyes glinting with a cruel rapture. "The apex predator. I am the teeth in the dark, the claws in the night. I am the terror that stalks on silent paws. I am hunger and fear and death." He stepped closer, his movements liquid and hypnotic. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was rooted to the spot, transfixed by that merciless gaze. "I am as old as these woods," the skinwalker continued, his voice dropping to a purr. "I have hunted here since before your kind first crawled out of the mud, and I will be here long after the last human voice has faded from the earth." His hand shot out, faster than my eye could track, and grabbed me by the throat. He lifted me effortlessly off the ground until we were eye to eye. I clawed at his wrist, but it was like scrabbling at iron. "You are my gift," he hissed, his breath hot on my face. "My tribute. In marking you, I have ensured my own survival. You will feed my hunger, forever." Horror crashed through me as I finally understood. The skinwalker needed fear and pain to sustain it, the way a lamprey needed blood. It had infected me, made me one of its own, so that it could glut itself on the suffering I would cause, on the lives I would destroy. I would be its instrument, its unwilling slave, until the end of my days. Despair welled up, black and crushing, and with it a surge of hopeless rage. No, I wouldn't let it end like this, wouldn't let this thing make me its pawn. If I was going to die, it would be on my own terms. It would be fighting. With the last of my fading strength, I lashed out with my foot, catching the skinwalker in the knee. I felt something pop, and the creature's grip on my throat loosened. I wrenched myself free and dove for my dropped badge, snatching it up and thrusting it at the skinwalker's face, like a cross before a vampire. The silver seared its skin, and it jerked back with a sharp hiss. I pressed my advantage, slamming my shoulder into its chest and knocking it off balance. The skinwalker fell to the cave floor, and I pounced on it, holding the badge to its brow and gritting my teeth against the stink of burning flesh. The creature thrashed and howled beneath me, its features distorting grotesquely as it shifted between forms, caught halfway between man and beast. But I held on grimly, fueled by desperation and the implacable desire to end this, to sear this curse from my soul, no matter the cost. Smoke billowed up from beneath my silver badge, thick and acrid, stinging my eyes and clogging my nose. The skinwalker's convulsions grew weaker and weaker, until finally it lay still, its body reverting fully to its human guise. I stumbled back, my head swimming, as the badge slipped from my fingers for the second time that night. And then, between one blink and the next, the skinwalker's body simply crumbled, collapsing in on itself like a sandcastle dissolving in the surf. It disintegrated into a fine black powder that sifted away on a breath of wind, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. For a moment I simply stood there, swaying on my feet as my brain struggled to process everything that had happened. It was over. The skinwalker was dead, destroyed by the purifying touch of silver. I stared down at my hands, half expecting to see the curse-born claws still sprouting from my fingertips. But they remained human, the same blunt, calloused fingers I'd always known. I felt lighter somehow, as if an immense weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The miasma of fear and rage that had clouded my thoughts had evaporated like morning dew. I took a deep, shaky breath, marveling at the way the air seemed cleaner, crisper. And then, finally, I let myself feel the magnitude of what I'd done. I'd beaten the skinwalker. I'd beaten the monster. I don't remember much about the hike out of the woods. I have vague impressions of towering trees and dappled sunlight, of the cheerful gurgle of a stream and the distant cries of birds. But it all ran together in a kaleidoscopic blur, my mind lost in a fog of exhaustion and residual shock. My next clear memory is of stumbling out of the tree line and spotting my cabin downslope, rising out of a sea of waving grass like a beacon. At the sight of that weathered timber and tin roof, of home, I felt my throat grow suddenly tight, my vision blurring with hot tears. I made my way down to the cabin in a daze, my feet carrying me of their own accord. But when I reached the porch, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I felt like a stranger in my own life, divorced from the man I'd been before this nightmare began. How could I possibly go back to my old routines, my old existence, after everything I'd seen and done? The Ahanu who had left this place had been a different person, innocent of the shadows that lurked at the edges of the world. I didn't know if I could ever be him again. But what was the alternative? To let this experience break me? To let it define me? No. I refused to give the skinwalker that victory, even in death. Slowly, deliberately, I turned the knob. The cabin was dark and cool, the air slightly musty from disuse. Dust motes swirled in the thin bars of light that slanted through the windows. It looked exactly the same as I'd left it, as if the events of the last few days had been nothing but a fever dream. For a moment I simply stood there, breathing in the familiar smells of wood smoke and old books, letting the silence settle over me like a blanket. Then I stepped inside and shut the door firmly behind me. There were still questions to be answered, reports to file, people to notify about Jessica. There would be a reckoning, of that I had no doubt. But for now I let the comfort of my little refuge enfold me, a shelter against the dark. I was safe. I was home. And no matter what else happened, I swore to myself that I would never forget the lessons I'd learned in the heart of the forest. The world was wider and wilder and more wondrous than I had ever dared imagine. Cruelty and horror, yes, but also strength and resilience beyond reckoning. I had walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but perhaps a bit wiser, a bit stronger. And as I built a fire in the hearth and set a pot of coffee to brew, I felt a small, tentative smile tug at the corners of my mouth. The future stretched out before me, unknown and unknowable. But I would meet it with my eyes open and my head held high. After all, I was a ranger. It's what we did. My name is Akacheta, which means fighter in the Lakota language. A fitting name for a park ranger, I suppose. I've always been drawn to the untamed beauty of the wilderness. It's why I took this job at Mesa Verde National Park in the remote wilderness of Colorado. But nothing could have prepared me for the horror I would face out here in these ancient woods. I grew up not far from here on the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe Reservation. My people have called this land home for generations, living in harmony with the spirits of nature. Growing up, I heard the stories. Tales of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches who don the pelts of animals to stalk the night. Fearsome creatures born of dark magic. As a kid, they gave me goosebumps. As an adult, I figured they were nothing more than spooky campfire stories. Until now, living alone out here in my little ranger's cabin in the heart of the backcountry, miles from anything resembling civilization, you start to believe in the old legends again. Especially when you hear things howling in the night that don't sound quite animal or human. Inhuman shrieks and cries that make your blood run cold. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. I took the job at Mesa Verde for a few reasons. One, it kept me connected to the land of my ancestors, a place I've always felt spiritually drawn to. Two, after a string of dead-end jobs, I was broke and needed work. The Park Service offered steady employment and a rustic little cabin to live in. Three, after my last relationship ended badly, I felt the need to get away from it all for a while and clear my head. Escape into nature to heal. If only I knew what I was walking into. But the first few months were quiet, peaceful even. I spent my days patrolling the park trails and ancient cliff dwellings, helping the occasional lost hiker find their way, and doing routine maintenance around the park. It was a solitary life, but I liked it that way. I've always been a bit of a loner. My only real companion was a scruffy dog who started hanging around my cabin. I called him Hoka Hey, a Lakota battle cry that roughly translates to, "Let's go," or "It's a good day to die." He was a scraggly but fierce little guy. Hoka took to following me on my daily hikes. I figured he was lonely out here too. But then I started to notice strange things on our hikes. Piles of animal bones picked clean. Unusual impressions in the dirt, like very large dog or wolf prints, but with an unsettling human-like quality to them, and sometimes the uncanny feeling of being watched from the trees. Then one moonless night in late October, I was awoken by chilling howls in the dark. At first I thought the noises were just coyotes yipping in the night. Their haunting cries are common out here, but the longer I listened, the more unearthly the sounds became. A wailing cacophony of tortured shrieks and snarls, getting closer to my isolated cabin. Hoka started whimpering and pawing frantically at the door, desperate to get out. Unnerved, I grabbed my flashlight and ranger rifle and slowly opened the door, scanning the dark woods. The night was pitch black and unnaturally silent, not even the usual chirping of crickets. Hoka bolted out into the darkness before I could stop him. I called after him in urgent whispers, not wanting to draw attention to myself but worried for my canine companion. The only response was a guttural growl and crash of underbrush in the distance, followed by a yelp that stabbed my heart. I knew it was Hoka. Then, abrupt silence again. I was torn between fear and loyalty to my dog. I could feel in my bones something deeply wrong out there in the night. My hand clutching the rifle was trembling as I cautiously stepped off the cabin porch. The darkness enveloped me as I crept into the trees. After about 50 yards, my flashlight beam landed on something that turned my blood to ice water in my veins. Hoka, sprawled on the ground, his body savaged and mutilated, and crouched over him, a creature that made no sense, a grotesquely deformed human-like figure, naked and caked with dirt and blood, with the unmistakable head of a coyote, the skinwalker. It turned slowly to face me, those glowing feral eyes burning into mine and unhinging its jaws to let out a scream that shattered the night. I turned and ran in sheer horror, that brain-scarring scream ringing in my ears. Adrenaline overrode rational thought. Some primal instinctual terror propelled me through the pitch-dark woods at breakneck speed, hurdling fallen logs, whipped by branches, my lungs and legs burning. I half expected to feel the creature's hot breath and teeth on me at any second. But as I fled blindly in panic, that hellish wail grew more distant, until all I could hear was my heart hammering in ragged breath. After running for what felt like miles, I finally stopped, gasping for air. I realized I had dropped my flashlight and rifle somewhere in my mad dash. I looked around desperately, trying to get my bearings. Slivers of moonlight peeked through the dense forest canopy. I was in a part of the park I had never explored before. Towering ponderosa pines creaked ominously in the chill wind. An oppressive sense of dread hung heavy in the air, like the whole forest was alive with ancient malice. Frantically, I tried to listen for any sounds of that unnatural creature, but an eerie silence cloaked the woods. My heart still racing, I looked around for shelter and spotted the dark maw of a small cave in a nearby rocky outcrop. Glancing behind me with a shudder, I crept inside, praying the skinwalker would not pick up my scent. Still too shocked and adrenaline-fueled to fully process what I had seen, I huddled in that cold cave and whispered every protection prayer I could remember, calling upon the spirits of my ancestors to keep me safe until daybreak. I must have passed out from exhaustion and stress because the next thing I knew, pale light was lancing into the cave entrance. I startled awake, scrambling backwards in fear before I remembered where I was and what I had seen. Part of me hoped it had all been a terrible nightmare, but Hoka's mutilated body was still vivid in my mind. That grotesque, half-human, half-coyote face with its burning eyes and bloody muzzle. How could it be real? I crept to the mouth of the cave, half expecting the skinwalker to be lying in wait. But the woods looked almost serene in the gray pre-dawn light, the horrors of the night fading like a dream. In a daze, I wandered until I found a trail I recognized and made my way back to my cabin. I realized I had a terrible choice to make. Part of me wanted to get in my truck and flee, leave this job and never look back. But if I did that, wouldn't I be abandoning my responsibility to this land and any other potential victims of that creature? I was torn with indecision. Then, as I walked up to my cabin, my heart froze. The door was hanging off its hinges. Deep, jagged claw marks gouged into the wood. The inside of the cabin was completely trashed, the sparse furniture broken, my meager possessions scattered and shredded. And there on the wall, smeared in what looked horribly like blood, "You are not welcome here, Akacheta." A chill ran down my spine. It knew my name. No, I quickly realized. It knew what my name meant in the language of our tribe. With grim resolve, I knew what I had to do. I could not abandon this sacred place to such evil. I had to fight this thing, like my ancestors before me. But I would need help. It was time to speak to the elders of my tribe and learn the ancient ways of dealing with skinwalkers. It was time to become a true akacheta, a fighter. I spent the next few days with the elders, learning the old stories and rituals. They taught me that skinwalkers are created through a perverse corruption of our people's ancient shape-shifting magic, that they feed on fear and pain, but that they can also be defeated with courage and wisdom. They gave me sacred herbs to burn and blessings to chant, a ritual to banish the dark spirit back to the underworld. And most importantly, they gave me an ancient stone arrowhead that they said held the power of the ancestors. But they warned me it would take more than herbs and prayers. I would have to face my deepest fears and be willing to sacrifice everything. So I returned to Mesa Verde, armed with ancestral knowledge and steely resolve. As night fell, I built a large fire outside my cabin and began the banishment ritual, chanting and burning the pungent herbs. I could feel the air tremble and crackle with energy, like the veil between worlds was thinning. Then I heard it, that soul-shredding shriek of the skinwalker, still far off in the woods but unmistakably drawing closer. My skin prickled with primordial fear, but I kept chanting, louder and louder, defiant against the dark. The creature burst from the trees, a thing of nightmares in the flickering firelight, coyote head thrashing, human limbs grotesquely elongated, claws grasping. I clenched the ancestral arrowhead and felt hot blood drip where it cut my skin. I smeared the blood in sacred patterns on my face, still chanting. The skinwalker crouched at the edge of the firelight, snarling, its eyes burning with ancient hunger. It spoke in a guttural voice that sounded like snapping bones. "Your ancestors are long dead, boy. You are alone and weak. I will crack your spine and suck the marrow while you scream." But I stood my ground, righteous anger and courage blazing through me. I raised the bloodied arrowhead and shouted, "Evil spirit, I banish you back to the depths. You are not welcome here. This is the land of my people and we do not fear you." The creature howled and lunged at me in rage. Time seemed to slow. I leapt aside as its claws slashed the air. I rolled toward the fire and grabbed a flaming branch. As the skinwalker whirled on me again, I thrust the flames into its feral face. It let out a shrill cry of pain and fell back, its fur smoldering. But the flames seemed only to enrage it more. It crouched to pounce again, muscles coiled. I knew this was the moment. With a defiant yell, I leapt forward and plunged the arrowhead deep into the monster's chest. The skinwalker screamed, an agonized, furious sound that seemed to shatter the night. It writhed and scratched at the arrowhead embedded in its chest. I held on desperately, chanting prayers I didn't even realize I remembered. The monster's form began to flicker and dissolve, cycling through animals and human shapes too fast to see. Then, with a concussive blast of heat and wind, it exploded into shreds of shadow and ash that slowly faded away on the breeze. The arrowhead fell to the scorched earth, clean and cool. The night was suddenly alive again with the normal sounds of the wilderness, as if a great weight had been lifted. I collapsed to my knees, shaking with exhaustion and relief, tears streaming down my face. I had done it. I had faced my deepest fears and darkest myths. For the land, for my ancestors, for myself. The courage of a true akacheta. But I knew it wasn't over. There would always be more evil to stand against in this world. And I would be there, a guardian at the edge of the firelight to meet it. A park ranger and a warrior. Akacheta. My name is Etu, which means sun watching in the language of my Abenaki ancestors. But these days, there's little sun to watch from the darkness of these woods. Only shadows, mist, and an ever-present sense of being observed by something ancient and malevolent. I took this job as a wilderness guide and ranger in the remote forests of northern Maine, for many reasons. To escape my troubled past in the city, where gambling debts and a ruined marriage had left me nearly destitute. To return to the land of my roots, where generations of my people once roamed free. And above all, to help others experience the majesty of the untamed woods, as my father and grandfather had. But nothing could have prepared me for the evil I encountered here. An evil whispered about in tribal legends, but which I had always dismissed as myths and campfire tales. Until now. It began when a group of campers failed to return from a trek to an old logging cabin deep in the misted valleys. I set out to find them, tracking their boot prints in the soft loam. But when I reached the cabin, I found only the splintered ruins of the door, claw marks gouged into the rough-hewn timber, and a single hiking boot lying in the dirt, stained with blood. They were gone, taken. And that's when I first felt it. The sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, a creeping dread that crawled up my spine and nested in my skull. I knew then that I was no longer alone in those silent woods. Something else stalked those shadowed trails, something that was not animal, not human, something older than the forest itself, and infinitely more vicious. The watcher in the woods. I barely slept that night, sitting hunched before a guttering campfire with my father's old hunting rifle across my knees. Listening to the night sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the skitter of some small creature in the underbrush, the mournful cry of a loon on the ink-black lake, and threading through it all, a hushed malevolence, a sense of an intelligence, as cold and patient as the stars overhead, observing me, studying me, savoring my fear. Twice I thought I glimpsed it, sliding like liquid shadow between the black boles of the trees, but when I blinked, it vanished, leaving me to wonder if it had only been branches stirring in the night wind, or something far worse. I recalled the stories I had heard from the tribal elders, gathered around the crackling fires of my youth. Tales of the skinwalker, a malign spirit that could assume the form of any living creature, the better to hunt its human prey. A being of pure hunger and hate, born from the darkest myths of my people. Was that what I had seen? A nightmare given flesh, haunting these mist-wreathed woods? Sleep was impossible, and dawn, when it finally came, brought no relief, only a leaden exhaustion. I knew I should abandon this place, report the missing campers to the authorities, and escape with my life. But the thought of others falling victim to that nameless thing kindled a slow burn of anger in my gut. This was my land, the land of my ancestors. Whatever dwelled in the dark hollows would find me no easy meat. After a quick breakfast of bacon and beans, I broke camp, shouldered my pack, and set out along the winding path that led deeper into the wilderness, following the faded boot prints of the lost ones. As a ranger, I had sworn an oath to protect those under my watch, and I aimed to keep it, even if it cost me everything, even if it cost me my life. The day passed in a blur of damp, gray light filtering through crowns of fir and spruce, my breath steaming in the chill air. The forest seemed to watch me balefully as I trekked along paths obscured by drifts of fallen leaves, my senses straining for any sign of the missing campers or the thing that had taken them. By midday, I reached a narrow defile where sheer granite cliffs reared up on either side, their dizzying heights vanishing into svelte banks of cloud. The way was treacherous here, with only a slim track winding between great boulders and fallen trees, and a steep drop beyond, where mist pooled in the valley like a moat of ghosts. It was there, on that lonely trail, that I found the first real signs of the creature's passing. A scattering of coarse black hairs snagged on a splintered branch. The remains of some small animal, a marmot or hare, torn to gory shreds. Cloven hoof prints stamped in the soft earth, far larger than those of any deer or elk. My blood ran cold at the sight. It was real then, that primal, lurking horror, and it knew I pursued it through its shadowed domain. I unslung my rifle and checked the load, my hands shaking slightly. The weapon seemed a pitiful defense against the inexplicable nightmare I faced, but it was all I had. Steeling myself, I pressed on, descending down the far side of the defile into a mist-shrouded hollow, choked with moss-draped pines. Crude glyphs had been gouged into the trees, depicting figures with the heads of snarling beasts, their teeth bared in wordless rictus. I didn't need to be fluent in the old language of my people to understand their meaning. Here there be monsters. As if in answer to that grim thought, a terrible cry erupted from the fog ahead, ululating and inhuman. a sound of despair and fury and bottomless hunger, the desolate wail of the skinwalker. Slinging my rifle to my shoulder, I broke into a stumbling run, following that awful howl. I no longer cared about stealth or caution, only the overwhelming need to confront the watcher in the woods and, if I could not defeat it, then to die fighting, as my ancestors had. Leading out a war whoop of my own, I plunged into the mist and the horror that dwelled within. Time lost all meaning in that mist-drowned hollow, as I crashed through drifts of leaves, hurdled fallen logs, and clawed my way up. I saw only flitting shadows in the fog, heard only echoing cries that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Glimpses of _something there and gone. A flash of matted fur, the gleam of yellow eyes, a fleeting afterimage of a monstrous silhouette, there and gone between one blink and the next. Malodorous stench filled my nostrils, rotten meat and damp fur and an underlying musk of something unearthly. It was the reek of the grave, of ancient barrows and boneyards, the fetor of long-buried things that should never have been unearthed. Then, all at once, I stumbled out from a screen of pine boughs into a silent glade, and the mist parted like a veil to reveal the old logging cabin. It crouched there amid a waste of briar and sumac, looking just as I remembered from my youth, when my father would bring me here on hunting trips. The same weathered timbers, the same sod roof sagging under the weight of years. But now, the windows gaped like lidless eyes, and the door hung drunkenly from one rusted hinge. Before that dark portal lay a litter of gnawed bones, broken antlers, shredded rags that might once have been clothing. And there, at the center of it all, sprawled the ravaged bodies of the missing campers, their sightless eyes staring up at the gray sky, their viscera steaming in the cold air. A wave of horror and revulsion crashed over me, followed by a terrible sinking despair. I had failed them, just as I had failed so many others in my life. My father, my wife, my unborn child, all lost to me because of my own weakness and folly. I sank to my knees in the blood-soaked earth, my rifle falling from numbed fingers. Hot tears coursed down my face, and a ragged sob tore from my throat. I no longer cared if the skinwalker took me. Part of me longed for the release of death, the chance to atone for my sins. But even as I knelt there, lost in my anguish, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, something moved among the trees, something that was not mist or shadow, but solid and real. My heart leapt with sudden desperate hope, and I forced myself back to my feet, snatching up my rifle. Could it be? Had one of the campers survived, somehow? Staggering forward, I called out in a cracked voice, "Hello? Is someone there? I'm here to help." But the only answer was a soft, mocking laughter that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. A laughter that turned my blood to ice in my veins. "Oh, Ranger," a voice hissed from the shadows. "You cannot help them now. They are mine, as you soon shall be." I whirled toward the source of that sibilant voice, bringing my rifle to bear. And there, in a shaft of wan light, I beheld a figure that seemed to waver and flow like mist made flesh. It was vaguely man-shaped, but taller, leaner, its proportions subtly wrong. Shaggy fur covered its powerful limbs, and wicked talons tipped its long fingers. But it was the face that froze the breath in my lungs. A nightmare visage caught between wolf and man, with a protruding muzzle lined with jagged fangs, and eyes that glowed a lambent yellow, lit from within by a feral, cunning intelligence. The skinwalker, the watcher in the woods. For a moment, I could only stand there, paralyzed with atavistic terror. Every ancestral memory, every primal instinct screamed at me to flee, to cower, to abase myself before this ancient predator. But as I stared into those pitiless eyes, my fear transmuted into something else. A cold, implacable anger, a righteous fury kindled by the broken bodies of the campers, by the monster's cruel taunts, by the pain and loss that had dogged my steps all my life, leading me to this final confrontation. "You," I said, my voice low and steady, "you're the one who's been stalking these woods, killing innocent people. But it ends now. It ends here." The skinwalker tilted its head, a hideously human gesture. "Brave words for a mortal, but you have no power here. This is my domain, as it has been since before your kind first walked these lands. I am eternal. I am hunger incarnate. And you are meat." With that, the creature lunged forward, a blur of shadow and savagery. But I was ready. I brought my rifle up and fired point blank into that snarling face. The bullet struck the skinwalker between its glowing eyes, and its head snapped back with a spray of black ichor. But incredibly, terribly, it did not fall. Instead, it let out a roar of fury and pain, and kept coming, its talons slashing for my throat. I fell back, desperately working the bolt of my rifle, but the creature was too fast. It caught me with a backhand blow that sent me sprawling, my weapon flying from my grasp to vanish in the fog. Dazed, bleeding, I scrabbled backward on hands and knees, feeling broken ribs grate in my chest. The skinwalker loomed over me, its maw dripping gore, its eyes blazing with malevolent glee. "Foolish mortal," it grated. "Did you think your pitiful weapons could harm me? I am the wild heart of these woods, the primal spirit of hunt and hunger. And now I shall feast on your flesh, and your screams shall echo through these valleys for eternity." It reached for me, its talons poised to rend and tear. But even as it did, my groping fingers closed on something hard and cold, half buried in the loam. A stone, ancient and heavy, worn smooth by unknown ages. Desperately, I brought the stone up in a wild swing, catching the skinwalker across its snarling jaws. Bone crunched, and the creature reeled back, shaking its misshapen head in stunned disbelief. Surging to my feet, I pressed my attack, raining down blows with the stone, aiming for those glowing eyes, that fanged maw. Black blood spattered my face, my hands, but still I did not relent. Could not relent. "This is for the lost ones," I shouted, punctuating each word with a crushing impact. "For the land, for my people." Something shattered beneath my onslaught, and abruptly the skinwalker collapsed, folding in on itself like a rotten snag crumbling to pulp. Its form seemed to shrink, to diminish, until nothing remained but a mound of matted fur and splintered bone. Panting, I stared down at the grisly remains, scarcely daring to believe it was over. The stone slipped from my blood-slick fingers, clattering to the ground like a gavel pronouncing final judgment. I had won. Against all odds, I had prevailed. But the victory felt hollow, empty. It could not bring back the dead or undo the long, lonely years of grief and pain. All I could do was make my slow, limping way back through the fog-bound forest to bear witness to what had happened here, to tell the tale, so that others might be spared the horror that had haunted these hills for so long. And as I walked, I fancied I could hear the whisper of ancient voices on the chill wind, the voices of my ancestors, welcoming me home at last. The world felt different after that day in the forest. Sharper somehow, more real. As if a veil had been ripped away, exposing the true, raw face of existence. I told my story to the authorities, to the media, to anyone who would listen. But few believed me. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack, a tragic case of mistaken identity. The ravaged bodies of the campers were laid to rest, and life in the little towns and logging camps went on much as it always had. But I knew the truth, and I would not be silent. I wrote down my account, every detail seared into my memory, and sent it far and wide. To newspapers, to magazines, to obscure websites dedicated to the paranormal and the unexplained. Gradually, other stories began to surface. Other encounters with strange, shadowy figures in lonely wood and desolate moor. Creatures that blurred the line between beast and man, between nightmare and reality. I pored over those accounts, searching for patterns, for clues to the origins and nature of the thing I had faced. And as I did, a grim certainty took hold in my mind. The skinwalker might be gone, but it was not the only one of its kind. There were others out there, lurking in the wild places of the world, ancient spirits of hunger and hate waiting to prey on the unwary and the innocent. And now, armed with hard-won knowledge and bitter wisdom, it was my duty to hunt them, to track them to their lairs and destroy them, as I had the watcher in the woods. No longer a mere ranger, I became something more, a guardian of the borderlands between the natural and the unnatural, a warrior against the dark. It would be a long, hard road, I knew, a lonely one, steeped in blood and terror. but I would walk it to the end, whatever that end might be. For I was Itu, he who watched the sun, and I had found my true calling at last in the savage heart of the wild. My name is Takiom, a name passed down from my Cherokee ancestors. I grew up in the backwoods of rural Appalachia, surrounded by towering oak and pine trees older than living memory, hunting, fishing, hiking. The forest was my home and my life. But times were tough. The factory jobs had dried up and I was barely scraping by, living in my old beat-up truck. That's when I heard about the job, a caretaker position at a remote cabin deep in the Monongahela National Forest. Room and board provided with plenty of solitude and fresh air. It seemed perfect for me. An escape from my troubles and a chance to save some money. I should have known it was too good to be true. The Forest Service ranger handed me the keys, a stack of firewood, some canned food, and a scratchy wool blanket. "Last guy quit after a week," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Said something in the woods was watching him. Cabin fever, maybe." He shrugged. "It gets awful lonely out there. No electricity, neither. You still want the job?" I nodded, trying to look unbothered, and loaded my meager possessions into the cabin's dusty interior. The ranger's mud-spattered truck rumbled off down the dirt road, leaving me in complete isolation. I stood on the sagging porch, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air, tinged with a strange odor I couldn't place, something rank and rotten that made my nose twitch. That first night, the wind howled ceaselessly through the chinks in the rough-hewn log walls. Sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned in the narrow, lumpy cot, my mind conjuring dark images from the ranger's words. Something in the woods was watching. Outside the tiny window, the trees swayed and creaked like arthritic fingers tapping at the glass, scritching against the roof. I pulled the blanket over my head like I used to do as a scared child, waiting for dawn. Gray light seeped reluctantly into the cabin as the sun rose behind a thick bank of clouds. Dragging myself from the cot, I stumbled outside to the old well, drawing up a bucket of icy water to splash on my face and take a few long swallows to wet my dry mouth. The cold jolted me awake, cleared the cobwebs. I still felt unsettled, groggy from my sleepless night, and that strange smell hung heavy in the damp air. It seemed to emanate from the dense wall of trees behind the cabin. Probably some dead animal, I told myself, shaking off a shudder. After a meager breakfast of canned beans heated on the ancient wood stove, I girded myself to make a circuit of the property and surrounding woods, part of my daily caretaker duties. I laced up my sturdy boots, pulled on my thickest flannel and a bright orange hunter's vest, and reached for my trusty Winchester rifle, a faithful companion on countless hunting trips with my father and grandfather. But as my fingers touched the cold metal, a wave of unease washed over me, raising the hairs on my arms under the thick flannel. Something felt wrong. Slowly, I lifted my eyes to the tree line. An unreasoning primal terror gripped me, the instinctive fear of prey that feels the predator's gaze. There, between the dark trunks, almost hidden in shadow, 2 points of sickly yellow light stared back at me, unblinking, unwavering, inhuman. Then they were gone, melting into the forest before I could be sure of what I'd seen. My heart thundered against my ribs and my breath came in ragged gasps as if I'd run for miles. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. You're jumping at shadows. But in my gut, I knew the truth. Those hadn't been the eyes of any animal I knew. The sour stench thickened as I moved cautiously into the trees, following the old deer trail behind the cabin. Rotted leaves squished beneath my boots, releasing puffs of noxious miasma. My eyes darted nervously, searching for a glimpse of sickly yellow between the pines, but I saw nothing. No squirrels chittering, no songbirds flitting through the branches. The forest was deathly silent, except for my own ragged breathing. Even the wind had died. It felt like an eternity before I circled back to the cabin, but it could only have been an hour. I stumbled gratefully onto the porch, shrugging off my pack. I'd seen no signs of whatever foulness lurked in the forest. No tracks, no scat, no clues to identify the source of my unease. Only that pervasive, inescapable stench and a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, the hair-raising certainty of being watched by some great, malevolent presence just beyond the edge of sight. Maybe it was time to cut my losses, leave this cursed job behind. Better to be broke than food for... No. I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild like some wet-behind-the-ears city kid, spooked by a few shadows and smells. Probably a bear kill I was smelling, I decided firmly. Well, this old country boy wouldn't be chased off by any bear. I was no soft greenhorn. But my new resolve lasted only as long as the fading light. As night crashed down, the noises began. At first I dismissed them as the usual sounds of the forest. Owls hooting, animals rustling through the brush. Then came a whistling howl that froze the blood in my veins. It was like no animal I had ever heard, an otherworldly wail ringing from the darkness. A long, wavering cry, undulating up and down as if in mocking imitation of human speech. And beneath it I thought I heard a guttural chanting in some ancient unknown language. The howling went on for hours, circling the cabin, drawing ever closer. I huddled on my cot, gripping the rifle, until utter exhaustion dragged me under and the nightmares began. I dreamed of dead things in the woods, skulls and bones hung with strips of rotting flesh, eye sockets seething with vile yellow light. Dreamed of dark forms lurking in shadow, pacing on too many legs, their movements jerky and unnatural. Of jagged teeth and wicked claws and an ancient voice like grinding stone, whispering forbidden secrets from the black void behind the stars. Secrets that would shatter a human mind if fully understood. I woke as the first light seeped into the cabin, my sweat-soaked union suit clinging to my shaking body. The morning brought no reprieve. The howling had faded, but a dreadful silence gripped the woods. Even the ever-present crows, nature's opportunists, made no sound. A sense of watchful anticipation hung in the air, the stillness of a crouched cat preparing to pounce. I stoked the dying embers in the stove, my hands hardly willing to obey me, managed to choke down a meager bit of jerky and hard biscuit. My head ached abominably, my thoughts sluggish and vague. Memories slipped away like minnows through grasping fingers. Why had I come to this place? Fleeting images of the world beyond the forest, honking cars, screaming sirens, a pretty girl's perfume, surfaced in my mind only to sink again into the mire of confusion. This cabin, this hateful forest, had become my entire existence. A shattering crash jolted me from my fugue. The cabin door burst inward, ripped from its rusted hinges, and in the opening stood a figure that stopped my heart. It had the shape of a man, but no man ever moved with such boneless fluidity. Tattered rags hung from its emaciated frame and its face. Dear God, its face. A hideous patchwork of animal skins crudely stitched together, all tooth and claw and matted fur. But worst were the eyes, glowing with sickly yellow fire in the daylight, seeing into the depths of my mind, my soul. I knew then that I looked upon a skinwalker, that dread creature of shamans and dark magic. Behind it, the trees seethed as if alive, whipping in a sudden frenzy. The stench of rot was overwhelming. The skinwalker took a jerky step into the cabin, its eyes never leaving mine as it lifted a long-fingered hand, and I began to scream. I have no clear memory of the events that followed. Fractured images kaleidoscoped through my mind. Trees whipping against a storm-black sky, the meaty thud of a fist or claw impacting flesh, the Winchester bucking in my hands, fire, so much fire, the skinwalker shrieking as flames consumed it, the crackle and hiss of burning skin. When my senses returned, I lay curled on the packed dirt outside the cabin, or what was left of it. Only smoldering embers and a few blackened timbers remained. My orange hunting vest was torn and filthy, my boots gone. Blood, mine or the creature's, smeared my hands and spattered my clothes. At my feet lay a mound of greasy ash and charred bones. The Winchester was nowhere to be seen. Despite my injuries, a sense of profound relief washed over me. The skinwalker was dead, returned to whatever hell had spawned it. The unclean feeling, the sense of being watched by some vengeful spirit, had vanished along with that awful stench. Even the crows were back, raucously claiming their gory prize. With a pang, I saw that the fire had consumed my pack along with the cabin and most of my possessions. The walkie-talkie was gone, but I was alive and blessedly sane. I didn't look back as I limped off through the trees, following the sun westward. In time, I stumbled across a dirt maintenance road, and from there made my way to an asphalt highway where a passing motorist picked me up. Told him I was a lost hiker, got turned around off trail, and he seemed to accept it, dosed up on his generosity with Christian spirit. I directed him to the nearest town and sheriff's station. The sheriff was a wrinkled old bird dog of a man, his face as creased as a walnut shell, and he had the damnedest accent I ever heard. But his eyes had seen things, hard things. When I described what happened at the cabin, he didn't scoff or call me crazy, just sighed and rubbed a hand over his stubbled chin. "I reckon you met the hungry one that walks on high ridges wearing tattered soles," he said finally. "The skinwalker, as you rightly called it. Thought we'd driven it off long ago, or maybe it finished with us, found easier prey. Reckon we was wrong. Gets more dangerous the more fear it smells." He shook his head, a shadow in his eyes. "'Twas bad medicine brought that thing into the world, and worse that keeps it. Old magic, dark magic." He turned to spit into a dented coffee can. "Best we can do is keep the fire hot and the shot and iron close to hand. Worked for my daddy's daddy and his'n before that." I spent 2 days recovering in the local clinic before I felt ready to travel. My mysterious savior, bless his heart, left me a clean set of clothes and enough money for a bus ticket. As I stepped off the Greyhound in my hometown bus station, breathing in the mingled smells of diesel and stale cigarette smoke, I felt the invisible bands constricting my chest begin to loosen. The terror of the last weeks, the skinwalker's hideous face, the endless nightmares, they all started to feel distant, fading like a half-remembered late-night movie. But even if what happened in those woods was just a fever dream, a hallucination, the product of isolation and imagination, it had given me a new perspective. The old problems that had driven me into the wild, that once seemed so overwhelming, the loneliness, the bills, the sense that the world was moving on without me, now felt small, manageable. After facing down a storybook monster, I could handle anything Nashville decided to throw at me. I was alive, and I was home. And that was enough. I never saw the Forest Service ranger again, and never went back for the pittance the government owed me. But I did make one stop before I hightailed it back to my old life, a visit to the Cherokee Reservation where the last of my father's people still lived. I described my experience to an elder there, a medicine man well-versed in the old stories. He nodded sagely as I told my tale, that same shadow in his eyes that I'd seen in the old sheriff's. "The skinwalker is a powerful spirit," he said, his voice dry as crumbling leaves. "A corrupt shaman who uses the dark arts to transform into an animal. It gains power from fear, grows stronger and more twisted the more terror it creates." He regarded me with eyes black as obsidian. "Few men face this evil and live, but remember this. The skinwalker may walk between worlds, but it is a lonely path, cut off from the land of the living and the dead. You are more than it will ever be. You belong." I nodded, unable to speak around the sudden lump in my throat, and clasped his hand in gratitude. As I walked out into the dusty reservation street, I fancied I could smell the sharp, clean scent of pine needles beneath the hot asphalt. But whether memory or message, I couldn't say. I climbed into my beat-up truck, the one constant in my vagabond life, and pointed it toward the lights of the city. In the rearview mirror, the forest receded until it was lost in the distance, and the dark spaces between the trees held no yellow eyes, no ancient evil waiting to swallow me whole. I was a child of the earth and the sky, and I would never again let fear rule my path. I was going home.